If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Edward Tanner. I'm a park ranger in Olympic National Forest, Washington. I've been doing this job for years, but let me tell you something. This forest, it's not like any other place. It's ancient, alive in ways most people wouldn't understand. And sometimes it feels like it's watching you. It was late October when this happened. The air was crisp and the trees, those massive Douglas firs, stood like silent giants, their branches blocking out most of the sunlight. Even in the middle of the afternoon, it felt like twilight down on the forest floor. That day started like any other. I was driving my forest green Jeep down an old fire road, checking for signs of illegal camping or hikers who'd wandered off the trails. The road was overgrown, bumpy, and surrounded by trees so thick you couldn't see more than a few feet into the woods. Then I noticed something odd, a strange fog clinging to the ground. It wasn't normal fog. It moved differently, swirling, around tree trunks like it had a mind of its own. The air smelled of pine, but there was something else too. A faint metallic scent, like old pennies. I slowed down, my hands tightening on the wheel. That's when I saw it. An RV parked in a small clearing up ahead. It wasn't supposed to be there, and this part of the forest was off limits to campers. As I got closer, I could see it was an older model, a 1973 Winnebago Brave with Arizona plates. The thing looked out of place here, like it had been dropped into another world. I parked my Jeep and stepped out. The air felt colder than it should have been for October. Much colder. I grabbed my radio and approached the RV cautiously. A family was sitting outside, a man and woman in their 40s, a teenage boy around 16, and a little girl, who couldn't have been more than 8. They looked startled when they saw me. "Afternoon," I said, keeping my tone friendly but firm. "You folks lost?" The man stood up quickly and nodded. "Yeah. We were trying to find a campground, but must have taken a wrong turn." I glanced at their RV and then back at him. "This area isn't open for camping," I said. "You'll need to head back toward the main road." The woman spoke up then, her voice shaky. "We tried leaving earlier, but the RV won't start," frowned. "Won't start? What's wrong with it?" The man shrugged helplessly. "I don't know. The engine just won't turn over. I offered to take a look at it. I know my way around an engine, but as I popped open the hood and checked things over, nothing seemed out of place. The battery was fine. Everything should have been working. But when he turned the key again, nothing." While I worked on the RV, I noticed something strange about their little girl, Lisa. She was sitting cross-legged on a blanket with some crayons and paper scattered around her. She wasn't drawing flowers or animals like most kids would. Instead, she was sketching these tall, thin figures with long arms and legs that bent in weird ways, like they didn't have bones. "What are you drawing there?" I asked her casually, looked up at me with big brown eyes and said in a quiet voice, "The stick people." Her dad chuckled nervously from behind me. "She's got quite an imagination," he said, but something about her tone made my stomach twist. Before I could say anything else, a sound echoed through the forest, a hollow knocking noise that seemed to come from all directions at once. It wasn't woodpeckers or anything natural that I'd heard before. It sounded deliberate, almost like someone or something was trying to get our attention. The family froze. "What was that?" the teenage boy asked nervously. I didn't answer right away because, honestly, I didn't know what to say. The forest around us seemed to grow quieter after that knock. Too quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just silence. I glanced at my radio clipped to my belt and frowned when static crackled through it unexpectedly. "Don't. Go." The words were faint but clear enough to send chills down my spine. "Did you hear that?" I asked aloud. The family shook their heads. They hadn't heard anything. I tried to shake off the unease creeping over me and forced myself to focus on getting them out of there before nightfall. But deep down, something told me this wasn't going to be that simple. I should probably tell you more about myself before we go any further. My name is Edward Tanner, and I've been a park ranger for almost 15 years now. People around here know me as the guy who can find lost hikers when no one else can. I know this forest like the back of my hand. Every trail, every tree, every sound it makes. Or at least I thought I did. But lately things have felt different. Strange. I carry my father's old compass with me everywhere I go. It's not just sentimental. It's reliable. Or at least it used to be. Ever since I started working in this section of the forest, the compass has been acting up. The needle spins. Wildly, sometimes, like it's confused about where north is. That's not supposed to happen. I also haven't been sleeping well. For weeks now, I've been having these dreams. Dreams of hollow trees and voices calling from deep underground. They're not nightmares exactly, but they leave me feeling uneasy when I wake up, like they're trying to tell me something. There's a scar across my left cheek that people always ask about. It's from a logging accident when I was a teenager. The same accident that killed my dad. He was a logger, and I was helping him out one summer when things went wrong. A tree fell the wrong way, and, well, let's just say I got lucky to walk away with only a scar. After that, I joined the Army as a field medic and served in Vietnam. I saw things over there that still haunt me, things I don't talk about with anyone. When I came home, I couldn't handle being around people anymore. So I became a park ranger to escape all of it. The noise, the crowds, the memories. But even out here in the quiet of the woods, those memories follow me sometimes. My ex-wife couldn't deal with it, the nightmares, the emotional distance. So she left me a few years ago. Now it's just me in this forest. And lately, this forest has been making me feel like maybe solitude isn't enough anymore. I've been investigating some strange animal deaths in this area for weeks now. Deer and elk found dead with no blood left in their bodies and these weird precision cuts on their skin. It doesn't make sense. No predator does that. The local indigenous tribes respect me because I take care of their sacred sites and listen when they tell me about the forest's history and folklore. They've warned me about certain places where people disappear, or things happen that can't be explained. This clearing where the Mitchell family parked their RV? It wasn't on any of those lists, but something about it feels wrong. As I stood there looking at Lisa's drawings of those stick figures and listening to my radio crackle with static again, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another case of lost campers or mechanical trouble. The teenage boy, his name was Jason, was fiddling with his cassette player while his parents argued quietly about what to do next. He hit record on it for some reason. I think he wanted to capture the strange knocking sounds we'd heard earlier, but when he played it back, there were whispers on the tape. Not faint noises or static, actual whispers. Help us. Leave. Jason froze and looked at me with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I nodded slowly but didn't say anything. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky now, casting long shadows across the clearing. The temperature had dropped sharply. Too, it felt more like winter than fall all of a sudden. I glanced at Lisa again. She had stopped drawing and was staring into the trees like she was waiting for something, or someone, to step out from between them. "What is she looking at?" Jason whispered to me. "I don't know," I replied quietly. But deep down, I had an idea. The forest was too quiet. If you've spent enough time in the woods, you know what I mean. There's always some kind of noise, birds chirping, leaves rustling, the distant sound of a stream. But now, nothing. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off and focus on the family. "Let's get you folks packed up," I said, trying to sound calm. "I'll drive you back to the ranger station in my Jeep. We can figure out the RV later." The parents nodded, but Lisa tugged on her mom's sleeve and whispered something I couldn't hear. Her Mom bent down to listen, then froze. "What do you mean, sweetie?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lisa pointed toward the trees. "The stick people are watching us." I followed her gaze but didn't see anything, just shadows between the trees. Still, her words sent a chill down my spine. Jason laughed nervously. "She's just messing with us," he said, but his voice wavered. "I didn't think she was messing with anyone." As we started gathering their things, I noticed something strange about the trees surrounding the clearing. There were symbols carved into them. Circles, lines, and shapes that didn't make any sense to me. They looked fresh, like they'd been made recently, but there were no tool marks. It was as if the wood had grown that way on its own. "Did you guys do this?" I asked, pointing at one of the carvings. The dad shook his head. "No, we didn't even notice those." I ran my fingers over one of the symbols. The edges were smooth and warm to the touch, even though the air was freezing. Now, I pulled my hand back quickly and wiped it on my pants, feeling a strange tingling sensation in my palm. "Let's hurry up," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. As we worked, Lisa wandered off toward the edge of the clearing to use the bathroom. Her mom called after her, but Lisa just waved her off and disappeared behind a tree. A few minutes later, she came back looking pale. "What's wrong?" her mom asked. Lisa clung to her mom's leg and whispered, "They're closer now." "Who's closer?" I asked gently. She looked up at me with wide eyes and said, "The stick people." Before I could respond, we heard that hollow knocking sound again, louder this time. It echoed through the forest like someone was banging on a giant drum made of wood. The Mitchells huddled together, their eyes darting around nervously. "It's just probably an animal," I said, though even I didn't believe that anymore. Then their dog, a golden retriever named Max, started barking like crazy and took off into the woods before anyone could stop him. "Max!" Jason shouted and ran after him. "Wait!" I called out, but he was already gone. I grabbed my flashlight and followed him into the trees. The light cut through the growing darkness as I called his name over and over again. Finally, I found him standing still in a small clearing about 50 yards from the RV. He wasn't alone. Max was there too, but something was wrong with him. His fur bristled as he growled low in his throat, his eyes reflecting yellow in my flashlight beam like an animal caught in headlights. But it wasn't just that. They looked different somehow. Glazed over, almost lifeless. "Jason," I said quietly, stepping closer to him. "Don't move." "What's wrong with him?" Jason whispered. "I don't know," I admitted. Max stopped growling suddenly and turned his head toward me in a way that didn't feel natural, like he was being controlled by invisible strings. Then he bolted back toward the RV without another sound. Jason and I followed quickly, our footsteps crunching on fallen leaves as we ran through the darkening forest. When we got back to the clearing, Max was sitting by Lisa's side like nothing had happened, but his eyes still had that strange yellowish tint. "What happened to him?" Mrs. Mitchell asked nervously. "I'm not sure," I said honestly. As we stood there trying to make sense of it all, Jason pulled out his cassette player again and hit record while pointing it toward the trees where we'd heard the knocking sounds earlier. When he played it back this time, the whispers were louder and clearer. "Leave before hollow." "What does that mean?" Jason asked shakily. I didn't answer because I didn't know what it meant, and because my flashlight had just picked up something else in the distance. Dozens of small reflective eyes watching us from between the trees at different heights. They didn't move or blink. They just stared back at us silently. The air felt heavier now, like it was pressing down on us, and my breath came out in visible puffs even though it wasn't cold enough for that yet. "We need to go," I said firmly. "Now." But deep down? I wasn't sure if we'd make it out of there at all. As I stood there in the clearing, I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on us. The eyes, those strange, reflective eyes, were still watching from between the trees. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stared. It made my skin crawl. I turned to the Mitchell family, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to stay close together," I said. "Let's head back to the RV. It's safer there." They nodded, but their faces were pale with fear. We started moving slowly, our flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. The shadows seemed alive, shifting and stretching around us. Every little sound, a twig snapping, a leaf rustling, made us jump. When we finally reached the RV, I felt a strange sensation wash over me, like the forest itself was aware of us being there. I glanced back at the trees and thought I saw something. A tall, thin figure moving between the trunks. My heart skipped a beat. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Jason, who was walking beside me. He nodded quickly, his face pale as a sheet. "What was it?" "I don't know," I said quietly, "but we need to stay inside." We climbed into the RV and locked the door behind us. The inside felt cramped and dark, with only our flashlights providing any light. The family huddled, together on one side while I stood by the window, peering out into the night. "Where's Max?" Lisa asked suddenly, her voice trembling. I looked around and realized that the dog was gone again. "He must have run off," I said, trying to sound calm. "He'll come back." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The knocking sound returned. Then, louder this time. It echoed through the forest like someone was banging on hollow wood all around us. The RV shook slightly, and Mrs. Mitchell gasped as she clutched Lisa tightly. "What was that?" she cried. "I don't know," I said honestly, my heart pounding in my chest. "Stay calm." I moved closer to one of the windows and shone my flashlight outside. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just beyond. The clearing. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs bending at angles that didn't seem natural. Its body looked like it was made of twisted wood and sinew, blending perfectly with the trees behind it. I froze. The creature tilted its head, slowly, almost like it was studying me. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. "Edward," Jason whispered from behind me. "What is that?" "I don't know," I said again, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we need to stay quiet." As if it heard me, the creature's head snapped toward the RV with a suddenness that made my stomach drop. Then it opened its mouth and spoke. "Edward, come outside." It was my voice, perfectly mimicked but hollow and wrong somehow. Lisa whimpered and buried her face in her mom's shoulder. Mrs. Mitchell held her tightly while Jason stared at me with wide eyes. "It's trying to trick us," I said firmly. "Don't listen to it." The creature moved closer then, its long fingers reaching out toward the RV's window. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were dark and empty pits that seemed to swallow all light around them. I could feel it feeding on our fear, growing stronger as we sat there frozen in terror. "Mommy," Lisa whispered through tears. "I'm scared." "Me too," Mrs. Mitchell admitted softly, her voice shaking. "But we're safe in here." "Safe?" I wasn't so sure about that anymore. Jason grabbed his cassette player again and hit record while pointing it toward the window where we'd seen the creature. When he played it back moments later, the whispers were louder than ever. "Leave. Hollow. Leave." "What does it mean?" Jason asked shakily. I didn't have an answer for him because something else had caught my attention. The lights inside the RV were flickering now, and when Mr. Mitchell tried starting the engine again, nothing happened. "It won't start," he exclaimed in panic. The creature outside let out a low, rumbling sound that almost sounded like laughter, deep and guttural. And I knew we couldn't stay here much longer. "We need to fight back," I said suddenly, an idea forming in my mind even as fear clawed at me from every direction. "How?" Jason asked desperately. "There are stories about this place," I said quickly, "about rituals that can protect people from things like this." "Rituals?" Mrs. Mitchell asked nervously. "Yes," I said firmly. though my heart was racing, now more than ever. But I need to go outside to gather what we need. Jason grabbed my arm tightly. Are you crazy? That thing will kill you. I don't have a choice, I said quietly but firmly as I unlocked the door and stepped outside into the cold night air. The creature was still there, closer now, and its hollow eyes locked onto mine immediately as if it had been waiting, for me, all along. Edward. It called again in my own voice, a sickening echo that made every hair on my body stand on end. I gripped my flashlight tightly and took a shaky step forward into the darkness beyond the RV's safety. I stepped out into the cold night air, my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. The creature stood just beyond the clearing, impossibly tall and thin, its twisted wooden limbs creaking softly as it moved. It didn't charge at me or attack. It just stood there, watching, waiting. Edward. It called again in my voice, hollow and wrong. Hearing my own voice come from something like that made my stomach twist. I forced myself to take another step forward. What do you want? I asked, my voice steady, even though fear was clawing at me from the inside. The creature tilted its head slowly like it was thinking. Then it raised one of its long fingers and pointed toward the trees. I followed its gesture with my flashlight beam and froze. There was a massive, hollow tree standing just beyond the clearing. I hadn't noticed it before. It seemed like it had appeared out of nowhere. The trunk was wide enough to fit a small car inside, and the opening at its base looked like a dark mouth waiting to swallow anything that came too close. I turned back to the RV and shouted over my shoulder, "Stay inside. Don't come out." Mr. Mitchell opened the door slightly and called back to me. "What are you doing?" "I need to find out what's in that tree," I said firmly. "It's connected to this thing." Before he could argue, I started walking toward the tree, keeping my flashlight trained on the creature as I moved. It didn't follow me. It just stood there silently, watching. When I reached the hollow tree, I shone my flashlight inside, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There were bodies inside, dozens of them. Some were little more than skeletons dressed in tattered clothing, while others looked almost fresh, like they'd been placed there recently. Their faces were frozen in expressions of terror, their mouths open as if they'd been screaming when they died. I stumbled back from the tree, nearly dropping my flashlight. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "What is this?" I whispered to myself. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Crunching on the leaves, I turned quickly and saw Mr. Mitchell running toward me with a heavy branch in his hands like a makeshift weapon. "I'm not letting you do this alone," he said firmly. Before I could respond, we heard a scream coming from the RV, Jason's voice. We both turned toward the clearing just in time to see the creature dragging Jason into the forest by one of its long wooden limbs. "Jason!" Mr. Mitchell shouted and took off running after him. I followed close behind, shining my flashlight ahead as we sprinted through the trees. The creature moved fast, faster than anything that size should have been able to move. But we managed to keep up by following the trail of disturbed vegetation it left behind. Finally, we reached another clearing where Jason was lying on the ground near another hollow tree. This one smaller but just as eerie looking as the first. The creature was standing over him, its limbs twisting and folding like origami as it prepared to drag him inside. "Let him go," Mr. Mitchell shouted and swung his branch at the creature with all his strength. The branch hit its arm but didn't seem to hurt it. It barely flinched before turning its hollow eyes toward Mr. Mitchell. Then something horrifying happened. Wooden spikes shot out from its body and pierced Mr. Mitchell's chest in an instant. He gasped and fell to his knees before collapsing completely, his eyes wide with shock as blood pooled around him. "No!" I screamed, rushing forward with my flashlight, raised like a weapon. The creature turned its attention back to Jason, who was barely conscious now but still alive. It reached for him again with one of its twisted limbs. But before it could touch him, I remembered something from one of the stories the tribes had told me about this forest. I grabbed a handful of dirt from the ground and threw it at the creature, while shouting words I'd learned during one of their rituals, words meant to weaken spirits tied to nature. The creature let out an ear-piercing screech and recoiled sharply as if the dirt had burned it. Its limbs twisted violently as it backed away from Jason and disappeared into the shadows of the trees faster than I could follow. I dropped to my knees beside Jason and checked his pulse. It was weak, but steady. He was alive. "Come on," I said urgently as I helped him stand. "We need to get back to your mom and sister." We stumbled back through the forest together, moving as fast as we could despite Jason's injuries. When we reached the RV, Mrs. Mitchell and Lisa were huddled, inside with tears streaming down their faces. "Where's my husband?" Mrs. Mitchell asked desperately when she saw us. I couldn't bring myself to answer her. I just shook my head slowly and said, "We have to go." She nodded through her tears and climbed into my Jeep with Lisa while Jason sat beside them in silence. As we drove away from that cursed clearing, I glanced at my rearview mirror one last time and saw something that made my heart stop. The forest behind us wasn't normal anymore. It was distorted somehow, like it was bending and twisting, unnaturally around itself. And standing at the edge of the clearing was that creature again, watching us leave. The drive back to the ranger station was silent. The Jeep's engine hummed softly, but no one said a word. Mrs. Mitchell held Lisa tightly in her arms, rocking, her back and forth as tears streamed down her face. Jason sat slumped against the window, staring blankly at the passing trees. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. I couldn't stop replaying everything that had happened in my head. The hollow, tree, the creature, Mr. Mitchell's death. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The forest around us seemed darker than usual, even though the headlights lit the road ahead. The shapes of the trees felt wrong somehow, like they were leaning toward us as we drove past. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to focus on getting us out of there. When we finally reached the ranger station, I parked the Jeep and turned to the family. "You'll be safe here," I said quietly. "I'll call for help." Mrs. Mitchell nodded weakly but didn't say anything. She looked like she was in shock. I stepped out of the Jeep and walked toward the station's radio to call for backup. My hands were shaking as I picked up the receiver and started speaking. "This is Ranger Tanner," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I need immediate assistance at Sector 7 of Olympic National Forest. We have injuries and casualties." I paused, unsure how to explain what had happened without sounding insane. "Just send help," I added quickly before setting the radio down. When I returned to the Jeep, Lisa was staring at me with wide eyes. "Are they gone?" she asked softly, crouched down beside her and nodded. "For now," I said gently. "But you're safe here." She didn't look convinced. Hours later, after emergency responders arrived and took the Mitchells away for medical care, I stayed behind at the station to file my report. But as I tried to write down what had happened, I realized there was no way to explain it, not in a way anyone would believe. How do you describe a creature made of twisted wood that mimics voices and feeds on fear? How do you explain hollow? Trees filled with bodies or symbols carved into wood without tools? It sounded like something out of a horror movie, not real life. In the end, I left most of it out of my report. I simply wrote that we encountered an unknown threat in the forest and that Mr. Mitchell had died trying to protect his son. But even as I wrote those words, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that whatever was out there wasn't finished yet. The Mitchell family moved back to Arizona after everything that happened. They didn't want anything to do with Washington or its forests anymore. And honestly, I couldn't blame them. Jason recovered physically but stopped talking about what he'd seen that night. Mrs. Mitchell told me he'd been having nightmares, dreams, about hollow trees and voices calling his name, but he refused to discuss them with anyone. Lisa seemed different too, quieter than before, but also strange in other ways. Mrs. Mitchell mentioned that plants seemed to grow faster around her now, that flowers bloomed overnight in her bedroom and vines appeared on their fence without explanation. One day she called me in tears and said Lisa's skin had started showing strange patterns under stress, patterns that looked like wood grain. I didn't know what to tell her because deep down, I knew Lisa hadn't escaped that night unscathed, that part of whatever was out there had followed her home. As for me, the forest hasn't felt the same since that night. Every time I drive past Sector 7 or hear knocking sounds echoing through the trees, I think about what happened and about what might still be waiting out there. Search parties went looking for Mr. Mitchell's body and for any sign of the hollow tree or the creature, but they found nothing. It was like it had all disappeared into thin air. But I know better. I know it's still out there, watching from between the trees, waiting for its next victim. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my cabin at night, I hear knocking sounds outside my window. My name is Jack Harmon. I'm a senior park ranger stationed in the Adirondack Mountains, New York. If you've ever been here, you'll know the forests are ancient, stretching endlessly with towering pines that seem to whisper secrets to each other. It's beautiful, sure, but it's also the kind of place that makes you feel small, like you don't belong. I didn't come here for the beauty, though. I came here to escape. After my divorce and years of carrying memories from Vietnam, memories I wouldn't wish on anyone, I needed to get away from people, from noise, from everything. The isolation felt like a blessing at first. But what happened here, well, it made me realize some places are better left alone. It started with a call about a missing hiker. His name was Marcus Whitaker, a local guy who'd gone camping deep in the restricted wilderness area. People disappear out here sometimes. It's not uncommon. The forest is unforgiving, especially in late autumn when the snow starts falling early. But this one felt different. Melissa Turner, my new partner, was eager to help with the search. She's young, 31, and full of energy, but she's never dealt with the real dangers of the wilderness. I could tell she wanted to prove herself, so I didn't argue when she insisted on coming along. We set out early in the morning, hiking through mist-shrouded valleys and dense pine groves. The air was cold enough to bite your skin, and the silence was eerie. Even the birds seemed to avoid this part of the forest. When we reached Marcus's campsite, it was unsettling. Everything was perfectly intact. His tent still pitched, his gear neatly packed, but there was no sign of him anywhere. It was like he'd just vanished into thin air. Melissa found something strange near the tent. Footprints. They were long and narrow, almost unnatural looking, and they circled the campsite without leading anywhere. "What kind of animal makes tracks like this?" she asked, her voice shaky. I didn't have an answer. Inside Marcus's tent, we found his journal. The entries started off normal, notes about hiking trails and weather conditions. But as we flipped through the pages, they grew more paranoid. He wrote about feeling watched, about shadows moving between the trees when he wasn't looking. The last entry sent chills down my spine. "They're closer now. I can hear them breathing." Melissa handed me something else, a Polaroid photo Marcus had taken. It showed an emaciated figure standing between distant pines, blurry but unmistakably human-shaped. "Do you think it's him?" she asked. "No," I said quietly. "I don't think that's Marcus." As we packed up to continue searching, deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out here, that something was watching us from the trees. We left Marcus's campsite behind, but I couldn't stop thinking about that photo, the figure in the trees. It didn't look right. Too thin, too still, like it was part of the forest itself. Melissa was quiet as we hiked deeper into the restricted area. I could tell she was shaken, but she didn't say much. She just kept glancing over her shoulder. The deeper we went, the stranger things got. The forest felt wrong. The air was heavy, like it was pressing down on us, and the usual sounds of the wilderness, birds, rustling leaves, were gone. It was dead silent, except for the crunch of snow under our boots. We stopped at a small clearing to rest, and that's when I noticed something odd. My compass, the one I've carried for years, was spinning wildly, like it couldn't find north. "That's not normal," Melissa said, staring at it. "No," I agreed. "It's not." Later that day, we met Dr. Walter Reed, a local historian who'd been studying the indigenous legends about this forest for decades. He wasn't surprised when we told him about Marcus's disappearance or the footprints we'd found. "This land has always been strange," he said, his voice calm but serious. "The tribes that lived here believed the forest was alive, not just the trees, but something deeper." He showed us old sketches and carvings depicting tall, thin figures, walking among the pines. They called them forest walkers, he explained. Spirits that could move through trees like shadows. They were said to lure people into the woods and never let them leave. Melissa frowned. "You don't really believe that, do you?" Dr. Reed shrugged. "I believe there's something unusual about this place." That night, Melissa and I set up camp near an old survey marker we'd found earlier in the day. It had strange symbols carved into it, symbols I didn't recognize, and it looked like it had been there for decades. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound I couldn't place, like wood cracking and groaning in the distance. At first, I thought it was just the wind or a falling tree, but then I realized it wasn't random. It was rhythmic, almost like it was communicating. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside into the freezing air. The mist had thickened, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The trees around our campsite had moved. They weren't where they'd been when we set up camp earlier. They were closer now, their trunks leaning inward like they were surrounding us. "Jack?" Melissa's voice came from behind me as she stepped out of her tent. "What's going on?" Before I could answer, I saw it, a tall figure standing motionless between two pines at the edge of our camp. It was impossibly thin, its limbs stretched unnaturally long, and its face, it didn't have one. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the figure, but as soon as the beam hit it, it vanished, like smoke blown away by the wind. Melissa gasped and pointed to the ground where it had been standing. A strange fungal growth had appeared there, a pale white patch spreading across the snow like veins. And then our radio crackled to life with static, and a voice. "Help. Me." It was Marcus. The radio crackled again. "Help. Me." The voice was faint, broken up by static, but it was unmistakably Marcus. Melissa grabbed the radio, her hands shaking. "Marcus? Marcus, can you hear us? Where are you?" There was no reply, just the sound of static fading into silence. I stared at the fungal patch on the ground where the figure had been standing. It looked alive, like it was pulsing faintly under the beam of my flashlight. I crouched down to get a closer look, but something about it made my skin crawl. It wasn't just growing. It was spreading, tiny tendrils creeping outward across the snow. "We need to leave," I said, standing up quickly. "Now!" Melissa didn't argue. We packed up our gear as fast as we could and started hiking back, toward the ranger station. The mist seemed thicker now, and the trees felt closer than ever, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow darting between the trees or a flash of pale white against the darkness. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. Melissa was quiet for most of the hike, but I could tell she was scared. Her breathing was shallow, and she kept glancing over her shoulder like she expected something to jump out at her. "Jack," she said after a while, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think Marcus is still alive?" I didn't know how to answer. The voice on the radio sounded desperate, but if he'd been out here for days, well, I'd seen what this forest could do to people. I don't know, I said finally, but we'll keep looking. We reached a small stream and stopped to refill our water bottles. As I bent down to scoop water into my canteen, I noticed something strange on the opposite bank, a trail of footprints leading into the woods. They were long and narrow, just like the ones we'd seen at Marcus's campsite. I stood up slowly and pointed them out to Melissa. Look. She froze for a moment before stepping closer to get a better look. Do you think they're his? I shook my head. No, they're too big. The footprints disappeared into the mist on the other side of the stream, but something about them felt wrong, like they weren't made by anything natural. Suddenly, there was a loud crack behind us, a sound like splintering wood, and we both spun around. At first, I didn't see anything, but then Melissa grabbed my arm and pointed toward the trees. There it was again, the tall figure from earlier, standing motionless between two pines about 20 feet away. It hadn't moved or made a sound. It was just watching us. Jack, Melissa whispered, her voice trembling. What is that? I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. My instincts told me to run, but my legs felt frozen in place. The figure tilted its head slightly, almost like it was studying us. Then it raised one impossibly long arm and pointed toward the trail of footprints on the other side of the stream. Melissa tugged on my sleeve. We have to go. I nodded and turned away from the figure, forcing myself to move even though every part of me wanted to stay and stare at it, like some part of my brain couldn't believe it was real. As we crossed the stream and followed the footprints deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking straight into a trap. We followed the footprints for what felt like hours. The deeper we went, the stranger the forest became. The trees seemed older here, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The air was colder too, and the mist clung to us like a damp blanket. Every so often, we'd hear distant cracking sounds, like wood snapping under pressure. But we never saw anything. Melissa was quiet, and I could tell she was on edge. So was I. My instincts were screaming at me to turn back, but something about those footprints kept pulling us forward. It felt like we didn't have a choice. Eventually, we came across another clearing. In the center was an old tree stump covered in moss and fungi. It looked like it had been there for centuries. Melissa walked over to it and crouched down, running her fingers over the strange patterns carved into its surface. Jack, she said softly, look at this. I stepped closer and saw what she meant. The carvings weren't random. They were symbols, similar to the ones we'd seen on the survey marker earlier. But these were more intricate, almost like they were telling a story. What do you think it means? Melissa asked. I don't know, I admitted, but I don't think it's good. As I studied the carvings, I noticed something else. Small patches of white fungus growing along the edges of the stump. They looked just like the fungal growth we'd seen at our campsite earlier. Melissa reached out to touch one of the patches, but I grabbed her wrist before she could. Don't, I said firmly. She looked up at me, startled. Why not? I don't know what it is, I said, but I don't want to take any chances. She nodded and stood up, brushing snow off her knees. Let's keep moving. We left the clearing behind and continued following the footprints, but something about Melissa seemed off. She wasn't talking as much as she had been earlier, and she kept glancing back toward the clearing like she didn't want to leave it. Are you okay? I asked after a while. She nodded quickly. Yeah, I'm fine. But she didn't sound fine. That night we set up camp near a rocky outcrop overlooking a frozen stream. It was a good spot, open enough that we could see if anything approached us, but sheltered enough to block out most of the wind. Melissa went to bed early, saying she was tired from all the hiking. I stayed up for a while, sitting by the fire, and listening to the sounds of the forest, or rather, the lack of them. It was too quiet out here, like everything alive had fled this part of the woods. I finally crawled into my tent around midnight, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying everything we'd seen. The footprints, the carvings, that tall figure in the trees. None of it made sense. At some point during the night, I woke up to a faint rustling sound outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just Melissa getting up to use the bathroom or something, but then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling our camp. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Melissa was standing in front of one of the trees at the edge of our camp, her back to me. She wasn't moving, just standing there in her pajamas with her arms hanging limp at her sides. "Melissa?" I called, out softly. She didn't respond. I stepped out of my tent and walked toward her slowly, shining my flashlight on her back. "Melissa," I said again, louder this time. She turned around suddenly, and for a moment, I didn't recognize her. Her eyes looked distant, unfocused, like she wasn't really seeing me. And there was something else. Her skin looked different. There were small patches on her arms and neck that had a rough texture, almost like bark. "Are you okay?" I asked cautiously. She blinked a few times and shook her head as if snapping out of a trance. Yeah, I'm fine," she said quickly. "I just couldn't sleep." But her voice sounded hollow, like she didn't believe what she was saying. I didn't push her for answers. I figured she'd talk when she was ready. But as we went back to our tents, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong with her. The next morning confirmed my suspicions. When Melissa came out of her tent, she was wearing long sleeves and gloves despite the fact that it wasn't that cold yet. She avoided looking directly at me and kept fidgeting with her sleeves like she was trying to hide something. "Are you sure you're okay?" I asked again as we packed up camp. "I'm fine," she said quickly. "Let's just keep moving." But when she wasn't looking, I noticed something sticking out from under one of her gloves, a small patch of white fungus growing on her wrist. Melissa didn't talk much as we hiked deeper into the forest. She kept her sleeves pulled down and her gloves on, even when the sun came out and the air warmed slightly. I didn't push her. I could tell she didn't want to talk about whatever was happening to her. But I couldn't stop thinking about that patch of fungus on her wrist. It looked just like the growth we'd seen near the campsite and on the old tree stump. The forest was changing around us. The trees were taller here, their trunks thicker and darker, almost black. Their branches twisted together overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. It felt like we were walking into another world, one that didn't want us there. Melissa started lagging behind, her steps slower and heavier than before. "Do you need to rest?" I asked, stopping to wait for her. She shook her head quickly. "No, I'm fine." But she didn't look fine. Her skin was pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in days. She kept glancing at the trees as if they were whispering to her. We finally reached a clearing late in the afternoon, and I knew right away that this was no ordinary place. The trees here grew in perfect concentric circles, their trunks spaced evenly apart like they'd been planted by someone, or something. At the center of the grove stood a massive hollow tree, its trunk wide enough to fit a small car inside. The bark was covered in strange patterns that looked almost human, like faces frozen in silent screams. Melissa stopped at the edge of the grove and stared at the tree, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and something else. Awe, maybe? Or recognition? "What is this place?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but it's not natural." I stepped closer to the hollow tree, my boots crunching over fallen leaves and patches of snow. As I got closer, I noticed something strange inside the trunk. Objects scattered across the ground like offerings. There were old backpacks, shoes, watches, wallets, personal items that looked like they'd belonged to dozens of people over decades. Some of them were so old they were falling apart. "Jack," Melissa said behind me, her voice trembling. "Look at this." I turned around and saw her crouching near one of the smaller trees at the edge of the grove. She was holding something in her hands. A photograph. I walked over to see what she'd found. It was an old black and white photo of a family, a man, a woman, and 2 young kids standing in front of a cabin. The edges were worn and faded, but I could still make out their faces. "This is Marcus's family," Melissa said quietly. I frowned. "How do you know?" She pointed to the back of the photo where someone had written Whitaker family in neat cursive handwriting. "How did it get here?" I asked. Melissa didn't answer. She just stared at the photo like it held some kind of secret she couldn't figure out. I turned back toward the hollow tree and stepped closer to peer inside. The ground beneath it wasn't dirt or snow. It was covered in a thick network of fungal growths that connected all the surrounding trees like veins running through a body. And then I saw them. The faces carved into the bark weren't just patterns. They were real faces. Human faces frozen in wood, their mouths open as if screaming for help. I stumbled back from the tree, my heart pounding in my chest. "We need to leave," I said firmly. Melissa didn't move. She was staring at one of the smaller trees again, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch its bark. "Melissa!" I shouted. She turned to look at me slowly, and for a moment, I didn't recognize her anymore. Her eyes were glassy and distant, and there were patches of rough bark-like texture spreading across her neck and arms. "They grow inside you first," she said softly, repeating words I'd seen written in her journal earlier. "What are you talking about?" I asked desperately. She didn't answer. She just turned back toward the hollow tree and started walking toward it like she was being pulled by some invisible force. I ran after her and grabbed her arm before she could step inside. "Melissa, stop!" She turned to look at me again, tears streaming down her face now. "It's too late," she whispered. "They're already inside me." Melissa's words hit me like a punch to the gut. "They're already inside me." I didn't know what she meant exactly, but I could see it. Something was changing her, and it wasn't natural. "Melissa, listen to me," I said, gripping her shoulders firmly. "We can figure this out. We'll get you help. But you have to stay with me, okay?" She shook her head slowly, tears still streaming down her face. "You don't understand, Jack. It's not just me. It's everything. The forest. It's alive." I stared at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. "What are you talking about?" Before she could answer, we heard a noise behind us. A low, creaking sound like wood bending under pressure. We both turned toward the hollow tree and froze. The fungal network on the ground was moving. It spread outward in slow, deliberate waves, creeping toward us like it was alive. The faces in the bark seemed to shift slightly, their expressions twisting into something even more horrifying, anguish mixed with hunger. "We have to go," I said urgently, pulling Melissa away from the grove. But she resisted, shaking her head again. "It won't let us leave." I didn't want to believe her, but deep down, I knew she was right. This wasn't just a forest. It was something much older and much more dangerous than anything I'd ever encountered. We stumbled back through the trees, away from the grove, but the strange cracking and groaning sounds followed us. It felt like the forest itself was alive, watching us, moving around us. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, Melissa sank to the ground and buried her face in her hands. "It's all connected," she whispered. "The trees, the fungus, even us." "What do you mean?" I asked, crouching beside her. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Dr. Reed told us about the legends, the forest walkers, the spirits that could move through trees. But it's not spirits, Jack. It's something real, something ancient." I thought about what we'd seen, the footprints that led nowhere, the strange fungal growths, the faces in the bark, and a horrible realization started to form in my mind. "It's a parasite," I said slowly. "A fungus that uses people as hosts." Melissa nodded weakly. "It doesn't just take over your body. It takes your mind, too. That's why Marcus sounded so desperate on the radio. He's still in there somewhere." I felt a chill run down my spine as I remembered the voice we'd heard earlier. Help. Me. How do you know all this? I asked quietly. She hesitated for a moment before pulling up her sleeve to reveal more patches of rough bark-like texture spreading across her arm. Because it's happening to me, she said simply. My stomach turned as I stared at her arm. The fungus wasn't just growing on her skin, it was becoming part of her. Melissa, I started, but she cut me off. There's no cure, she said firmly. Once it starts, there's no stopping it. I wanted to argue with her, to tell her she was wrong, but deep down, I knew she wasn't. The forest had claimed her just like it had claimed Marcus and all those other people whose belongings we'd found in the hollow tree. But there was one thing I couldn't figure out. Why hadn't it taken me yet? As if reading my mind, Melissa gave me a sad smile. It's already inside you too, she said softly. You just don't feel it yet. Melissa's words sent a cold shiver down my spine. It's already inside you too. I wanted to deny it, to tell her she was wrong, but something about the way she said it. I couldn't shake the feeling that she might be right. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The mist was thicker now, swirling around us like it had a mind of its own. We needed to find shelter before nightfall, but every part of me wanted to keep moving, to get as far away from the grove as possible. Melissa was struggling to keep up. Her steps were slow and uneven, and she kept pausing to lean against trees, her breathing shallow. I'm fine, she said every time I asked if she needed to rest, but she wasn't fine. She was getting worse. We finally found a small overhang of rocks near a frozen stream and decided to stop for the night. I built a fire while Melissa sat quietly, staring into the flames with a blank expression. She hadn't spoken much since we left the grove, and her silence was starting to scare me more than anything else. As the night wore on, the forest seemed to close in around us. The cracking and groaning sounds were louder now, echoing through the trees like some kind of warning. I kept my flashlight and my father's hunting knife close, even though I wasn't sure what good they would do against whatever was out there. Melissa finally broke the silence. Do you remember what Dr. Reed said about the forest walkers? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded slowly. He said they were spirits that could move through trees. She shook her head. They're not spirits, Jack. They're people. People who've been taken by the fungus. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. You mean those figures we've seen? She nodded again. They're what's left of the people who disappeared here. The hikers, the campers, Marcus. I thought about Marcus's voice on the radio. Help. Me. If Melissa was right, then he wasn't dead. He was still out there somewhere, trapped in whatever form the fungus had turned him into. Is there any way to stop it? I asked desperately. Melissa looked at me with sad eyes. You can't stop it, she said simply, but you can slow it down. Before I could ask her what she meant, we heard something. Footsteps crunching through the snow nearby. They were slow and deliberate, circling our camp just out of sight. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but all I could see was mist and shadows. Who's there? I called out. There was no answer, just more footsteps. Closer now, Melissa stood up slowly and pointed toward the edge of the camp. It's him, she said quietly. I followed her gaze and froze. Marcus was standing just beyond the firelight, his body twisted and deformed like something out of a nightmare. His skin had turned gray and rough like bark, and his limbs were elongated and thin like branches. But his face was still human enough to recognize. Marcus? I said cautiously. He didn't respond. He just stared at us with hollow eyes that seemed both desperate and empty at the same time. Melissa stepped toward him, her movements slow and deliberate like she didn't want to scare him away. It's okay, she said softly. We're here to help. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his mouth opening as if he wanted to say something, but no sound came out. And then we saw them, more figures emerging from the mist around us. They were all twisted and deformed like Marcus, their bodies barely recognizable as human anymore. Some crawled on all fours like animals. Others moved stiffly as if their limbs didn't bend properly. "We have to go," I said urgently, grabbing Melissa's arm. But she didn't move. She just stared at Marcus, with tears in her eyes. "He's still in there," she whispered. The figures started closing in on us slowly, their movements jerky but deliberate, like they knew exactly what they were doing. The firelight flickered as one of them stepped closer, its shadow stretching. Across the snow toward us, I tightened my grip on Melissa's arm and pulled her toward me. "Come on!" I shouted. She finally snapped out of her trance and followed me as we ran into the darkness, leaving the fire behind us. The figures didn't chase us. They just stood there watching as we disappeared into the mist. The forest felt alive now, watching, waiting, closing in around us. Every crack of wood and rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. Melissa was barely keeping up, her movement sluggish as the patches of bark-like texture on her skin grew larger. I knew we couldn't keep running forever. If we didn't act soon, the forest would take both of us. We stopped near a rocky outcrop to catch our breath, and I finally made up my mind. "Melissa," I said firmly, "we need to destroy that grove." She looked at me with tired, glassy eyes. "You can't destroy it," she said softly. "It's too big, too old." I shook my head. "We have to try. If we don't, it'll keep spreading, taking more people." Melissa hesitated for a moment before nodding weakly. "How?" she asked. I thought about the fire we'd left behind earlier and the fungal network we'd seen connecting all the trees in the grove. Fire was our best chance. It might not destroy everything, but it could damage the network enough to stop it from growing. Using what little supplies we had left, I started improvising. Incendiary devices, small bundles of cloth soaked in fuel from my emergency kit. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. Melissa watched me quietly as I worked, her hands trembling as she held one of the bundles. "What if it doesn't work?" she asked. I didn't answer. I couldn't let myself think about that possibility. We made our way back toward the grove. The mist grew thicker, swirling around us like it was trying to stop us from reaching our destination. The cracking sounds were louder now, echoing through the trees like some kind of warning. When we reached the grove, I froze. The hollow tree at the center looked even more menacing than before, its bark shifting and twisting like it was alive. The faces carved into its surface seemed to watch us as we approached. Melissa stopped at the edge of the grove and stared at the tree, her expression unreadable. "It's inside me," she whispered suddenly. I turned to look at her, confused. "What?" She pulled up her sleeve to reveal her arm, now almost completely covered in bark-like texture. "The fungus," she said quietly. "It's part of me now." Before I could respond, she stepped into the grove and turned to face me. Her movements were slow and deliberate, like she was fighting against something pulling her forward. "You have to do this," she said firmly. "Even if it means killing me." I stared at her in shock. "Melissa." "No." She shook her head slowly. "It's too late for me, Jack, but you can still stop it." Suddenly, the ground beneath us began to shift, the fungal network spreading outward from the hollow, tree-like veins reaching for us. Figures started emerging from the mist again, twisted forms that had once been human but were now something else entirely. Marcus was among them, his body almost completely transformed into wood and fungus. He moved stiffly toward Melissa, his hollow eyes locked on hers. Melissa turned back to me one last time and smiled faintly. "Do it," she said softly. I felt tears sting my eyes as I lit one of the incendiary devices and threw it toward the hollow tree. The flames caught quickly, spreading across the fungal network like wildfire. The figures screamed, a sound that wasn't human but filled with pain, and began retreating into the mist as the fire consumed the grove. Melissa fell to her knees, Near the edge of the flames, her body trembling as patches of bark began falling away from her skin like ash. I ran toward her and grabbed her shoulders, pulling her away from the fire just as the hollow tree collapsed in a burst of sparks and smoke. The grove burned for hours, the flames devouring the ancient tree and the fungal network beneath it. The fire spread to the surrounding trees, sending thick smoke curling into the misty sky. I stood there, watching as the forest seemed to fight back, the cracking sounds growing louder, branches twisting and snapping. But eventually, the fire won. The grove was gone. Melissa lay on the ground beside me, barely conscious. Her breathing was shallow and her skin, what was left of it, looked raw and fragile, like she'd been burned from the inside out. The bark-like patches were gone now, but her body was weak, and I didn't know if she'd survive. "Melissa," I said softly, kneeling beside her. "It's over." She opened her eyes slowly and gave me a faint smile. "You did it," she whispered. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I wasn't sure. The fire had destroyed the grove, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't done with us yet. As dawn broke, a search party led by Sheriff Doug Patterson finally found us. They'd been looking for Marcus for days and had heard about our distress call before everything went silent. When they saw the burned grove and Melissa's condition, their faces were a mix of confusion and horror. "What happened here?" Patterson asked, his voice sharp. I didn't know how to explain it, how to make him understand what we'd seen. "The forest," I said simply. "It's not what you think it is." Patterson frowned but didn't press me for more details. He helped carry Melissa back to safety while I followed behind, my body aching from exhaustion and injuries I hadn't even noticed until now. As we reached the ranger station, I felt a strange sensation in my arm, a dull ache that wouldn't go away. I rolled up my sleeve and froze. There it was, a small patch of white fungus growing near a cut on my forearm. I stared at it for a long time, my mind racing. Melissa had said it was already inside me, that I couldn't escape it, and now I knew she was right. Later that day, as I packed up my things to leave the Adirondacks for good, I noticed something else, a tiny wooden growth on my palm, barely noticeable but unmistakably there. I requested a transfer to a desert park far away from any forests or fungi. But as I zipped up my bag and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter where I went, the forest would follow me. My name is Alex Mercer. I'm a park ranger stationed at Blackwood National Forest, a place so remote and untouched that it feels like stepping into another world. The forest is ancient, with towering old-growth trees that seem to stretch endlessly into the sky. It's the kind of place where the fog clings to the ground like a living thing, and the silence is so heavy it presses against your ears. I've been doing this job for 15 years now. I've seen just about everything. Lost hikers, wild animal attacks, freak storms, but nothing ever prepared me for what happened last autumn. People talk about the beauty of nature, but they forget how unforgiving it can be. Blackwood isn't just a forest. It's something else entirely. Something alive. I came here to escape. 3 years ago, I lost a group of hikers under my watch. They vanished without a trace, and I still carry the weight of that failure every day. My marriage fell apart not long after, and when the opportunity came to take this isolated post, I jumped at it. I thought being alone out here might help me find some peace, or at least keep my mind busy. The locals have their stories about Blackwood. They talk about the Watchers, ancient guardians of the forest who punish those who disrespect it. I always dismiss those tales as superstition, something to scare kids around a campfire, but after what I've seen, I'm not so sure anymore. It started on a cold November morning. The snow had come early that year, blanketing the forest in white and making everything seem even more still than usual. I was out on patrol near the edge of the restricted wilderness area. a part of the forest that's been off limits for decades. Nobody really knows why. But there are rumors about strange disappearances and sightings of things that don't belong in this world. I didn't believe any of it. Not then. It was quiet that morning. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. The snow crunched under my boots as I walked along the trail, my breath fogging up in the cold air. I was checking for signs of wildlife or anything unusual, just part of my daily routine. But then I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. There were footprints in the snow, but they weren't normal. They were massive, much larger than any animal I'd ever seen out here. Each print was deep, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. The shape was strange too, long and narrow, with claw-like indentations at the front. I crouched down to get a closer look and noticed something else. Dark smears around the edges of the tracks. It wasn't mud or dirt. It looked like dried blood. I followed the tracks deeper into the forest, my heart beating faster with every step. The prints were erratic, like whatever made them had been moving in a hurry or maybe struggling. Branches were broken along the path, and tufts of long black hair were caught in the splinters. The hair didn't look like it belonged to any animal I knew. It was coarse and unnaturally long, almost like human hair but thicker. The trail led me to a clearing, and that's when things got worse. In the middle of the snow-covered ground was a bull elk, or what was left of it. The body had been torn apart, its legs twisted at unnatural angles and its chest ripped open. The organs weren't, scattered randomly. They were arranged in a pattern around the carcass, almost like someone, or something, had placed them there deliberately. I stared at the scene for what felt like forever, trying to make sense of it. My stomach churned, and I felt an icy chill crawl up my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. This wasn't a bear attack or wolves. It didn't match anything I'd ever seen before. I took out my notebook and started documenting everything. The tracks, the hair, the elk's remains. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The forest felt different somehow, heavier. Every sound, the creak of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made me jump. It was like something was watching me from just beyond the trees. I decided to head back to my cabin before things got worse. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint knocking sound echo through the forest. It wasn't loud or sharp. It was rhythmic, almost like someone tapping on wood far away. I froze in place, listening as the sound grew louder and closer. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I turned and hurried back toward my cabin as fast as I could without running. The tracks followed me all the way back to where the trail began before disappearing into the deeper woods. When I reached my cabin, I locked the door behind me and tried to calm down. My hands were shaking as I wrote down everything I'd seen in my logbook. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on my notes, I couldn't shake that feeling, that weight pressing down on me. Something wasn't right in Blackwood Forest. That night, the storm rolled in. Heavy snow and howling winds battered the cabin, making it feel even smaller and more isolated than usual. The radio was my lifeline out here, but the weather had knocked out the signal. I was completely cut off from the outside world. I tried to distract myself by going over my notes again. The footprints, the hair, the elk. It didn't add up. I'd seen bear attacks before, and wolves don't leave patterns like that. Whatever did this wasn't hunting for food. It felt like it was sending a message. As I sat there at my desk, I heard it again. The knocking sound. Faint at first, like it was coming from far away. But it wasn't long before it grew louder, closer. It wasn't random either. It had a rhythm to it, almost like someone tapping out a signal. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my breath catching in, my throat as the cold hit me. The snow was falling thick and fast, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I shined the beam of light around the clearing but saw nothing. No movement, no tracks. Just snow and silence. Then I noticed something strange near the edge of the porch. It was an elk leg. Just one, standing upright in the snow like someone had planted it there. The fur was matted with blood, and the jagged end where it had been torn from the body looked fresh. My stomach turned as I stared at it, trying to understand what I was looking at. I backed into the cabin and locked the door again, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't normal. This wasn't natural. Whatever was out there wasn't just an animal. It was something else. The knocking continued throughout the night, sometimes coming from one side of the cabin, sometimes from another. It felt like whatever was out there was testing me, waiting for me to make a mistake. By morning, the storm had buried everything in snow. The elk leg was gone, no sign of it anywhere, but now there were more tracks circling the cabin. They were similar to the ones I'd seen before, but larger this time, deeper. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. Something was out there in Blackwood Forest. Something watching me, waiting for me to slip up. The storm finally eased up by the afternoon, but the forest didn't feel any calmer. If anything, it felt heavier, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I decided to step outside and check the area around the cabin. I needed answers, or at least some clue about what was going on. The snow was deep, almost up to my knees, but I forced myself to move slowly and carefully. The tracks from last night were still there, circling the cabin in a wide loop. I followed them for a while, but they led straight into the restricted wilderness area, the part of the forest no one was supposed to enter. I stopped at the edge of the boundary and stared into the trees. The shadows seemed darker there, like they were hiding something. That's when I saw it. A shape moving through the snow about 50 yards away. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but it was too tall, too upright. It wasn't walking like an animal. It was moving like a person. My breath caught in my throat as I realized there wasn't just one figure. There were three. They were massive, towering over 7 feet tall, with long limbs that seemed to move unnaturally fast through the snow. Their bodies were covered in dark fur or hair, blending into the shadows of the trees. I couldn't make out their faces, but their movements were deliberate, almost intelligent. I froze, gripping my flashlight tightly even though it was still daylight. The figures stopped moving and turned toward me, their heads tilting slightly as if they were studying me. For a moment, neither of us moved, just staring across the snow-covered ground. Then one of them stepped closer. It didn't rush or charge, it just moved slowly and deliberately toward me. That's when I heard it, the knocking sound again, but this time it wasn't coming from far away, it was coming from them. The sound echoed through the trees as all three figures began knocking on nearby branches or trunks with their hands, or claws. I couldn't tell which. It wasn't random. It had a rhythm to it, like they were communicating with each other. I backed up slowly toward the cabin without taking my eyes off them. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The figures didn't follow me. They just stood there watching as I retreated. When I reached the cabin and locked myself inside, I peeked out through the window. They were gone. No sign of them anywhere, but I knew they hadn't left for good. That night was worse than any before. The knocking returned, louder this time and coming from all sides of the cabin. It felt like they were testing me again, looking for weaknesses in my defenses. At one point, I thought I heard something else, a low, guttural sound that almost sounded like words. It wasn't clear enough to understand, but it sent chills down my spine all the same. When dawn finally came, everything went quiet again. But as I stepped outside to check for tracks, I found something new. A single claw mark scratched into the wood of my porch railing. By mid-morning, I was starting to feel the weight of the isolation. The claw mark on the porch railing was a reminder that whatever was out there wasn't going to leave me alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even when I was inside the cabin with the door locked. I was sitting at my desk, staring at the radio, hoping it would crackle back to life. The storm had knocked out the signal for days now, and I hadn't heard a single voice since it started. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a faint buzz. I grabbed the receiver and tried to tune it in. "Alex? Alex, are you there?" It was Denise Walker, my new partner. She sounded worried. I scrambled to respond. "Denise, yes, I'm here. You need to stay away from—" Before I could finish, the signal cut out again. I slammed the receiver down, in frustration. Denise was young and eager, but she didn't know what she was walking into. If she came out here now, she'd be putting herself in danger. Hours passed before I heard the sound of an approaching snowmobile. When I stepped outside, Denise and Marcus Thompson, the local guide, were pulling up near the cabin. Marcus had been hired by Denise to help navigate through the forest after hearing about my strange radio messages. "What's going on here?" Denise asked as she climbed off the snowmobile. Her face was pale and her eyes darted nervously around the clearing. "Didn't know where to start." "There's something out here," I said finally. "Something that doesn't want us here." Marcus frowned and glanced toward the trees. "You mean the Watchers," he said quietly. Denise looked confused, but Marcus didn't explain further. Instead, he gestured for us to go inside so we could talk. Once we were inside, I told them everything. The tracks, the elk carcass, the knocking sounds, and the figures I'd seen in the snow. Marcus listened carefully but didn't seem surprised. "The elders always warned people about this part of Blackwood," he said after I finished. "The Watchers protect their territory. They don't like outsiders." Denise shook her head in disbelief. "This is crazy," she muttered. "It has to be some kind of animal, maybe a bear or wolves." Before anyone could respond, there was a loud bang on the door that made all three of us jump. It wasn't knocking this time. It sounded like something heavy slamming against the wood. I grabbed my flashlight and motioned for them to stay back as I opened the door a crack. Standing outside in the snow was Riker Johnson, the hiker who had been reported missing weeks ago. He looked terrible. His face pale and sunken, his clothes torn and covered in blood. He stumbled forward into the cabin without saying a word before collapsing onto the floor. "Riker!" Denise knelt beside him while Marcus checked his pulse. He was alive, but barely conscious. "What happened to you?" I asked him urgently. Riker's eyes fluttered open for a moment, and he whispered one word. "Them." Riker was trembling, his breathing shallow and uneven. His face was pale, and his eyes darted around the cabin like he expected something to burst through the walls at any moment. Denise tried to calm him down, but he was too far gone, terrified beyond anything I'd ever seen. "What happened out there?" I asked again, keeping my voice steady. "Riker, you need to tell us." He shook his head violently, his hands gripping the edges of the blanket Denise had wrapped around him. They're watching," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They don't stop. They don't let you leave." Marcus leaned forward, his expression grim. "You saw them, didn't you?" he asked quietly. Riker's eyes widened. He nodded, tears streaming down his face. They're not animals. They're not human either. They know the forest better than anyone." I felt a chill run down my spine as Riker's words sank in. Marcus seemed to understand more than he was letting on. "What are they?" Denise asked, her voice shaking. Marcus hesitated before answering. "The Watchers," he said finally. "The elders say they've been here for centuries, long before people came to Blackwood. They protect the forest, the deepest parts of it. If you disrespect their territory, or try to take what doesn't belong to you, they make sure you don't come back." Denise looked at me like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "This can't be real," she said, shaking her head. "It's just a story." I wanted to agree with her. I wanted to believe this was all some kind of misunderstanding, but I couldn't ignore what I'd seen or the fear in Riker's eyes. As if on cue, there was a loud knock at the door that made all of us freeze in place. It wasn't frantic or aggressive. It was slow and deliberate, like whoever or whatever was outside wanted us to know they were there. Riker panicked. He scrambled to his feet and bolted for the door despite our attempts to stop him. "Riker, wait!" I shouted, but it was too late. He threw the door open and ran into the snow-covered clearing, disappearing into the swirling fog before any of us could follow him. We stood there in stunned silence for a moment before Marcus spoke up. "He's not coming back," he said quietly. Denise glared at him. "How can you say that? We have to go after him." Marcus shook, his head firmly. "If we go out there now, we'll only make things worse." I didn't want to admit it, but I knew he was right. The creatures, or watchers, were out there somewhere, waiting for us to make a mistake. A few minutes later, we heard something outside, a soft thud on the porch. I opened the door cautiously and found Riker's backpack sitting there in the snow. It was torn and bloodied, with fresh claw marks across the fabric. Beside it was a trail of belongings, pieces of clothing, scraps of paper, leading into the forest like breadcrumbs. Marcus stepped forward and looked at me with a grim expression. "They're warning us," he said simply. The cabin felt smaller than ever, like the walls were closing in on us. Outside, the snow was falling heavier, and the forest seemed darker, even though it was still daylight. None of us spoke for a while. We just sat there, listening to the wind howl and the occasional creak of the trees. Marcus broke the silence first. "They're testing us," he said quietly. "They want to see if we'll leave." Denise shook her head, her voice trembling. "We can't just sit here and do nothing. Riker's out there. He might still be alive." Marcus didn't respond. Right away. Instead, he walked over to the window and stared out at the forest. "If he's alive," he said finally, "he's not in a place we can reach." I didn't want to believe him, but deep down I knew he was right. Whatever had taken Riker wasn't going to let him go. As night fell, the knocking started again. It was louder this time, more insistent. It came from all sides of the cabin, moving from one wall to another like they were circling us. Denise tried to keep herself busy by checking our supplies, but I could see the fear in her eyes every time the sound echoed through the room. Then came something new. Voices. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on us, but as I listened closer, I realized it wasn't random noise. It sounded like human voices calling out from the forest. "Help. Please." The words were faint but clear enough to send chills down my spine. Denise jumped to her feet and ran to the window. "Someone's out there," she said urgently. Marcus grabbed her arm before she could go any further. "It's not someone," he said firmly. "It's them." I didn't understand what he meant until I heard another voice. A man's voice this time. "Denise, come outside." Her face went pale as she turned to look at Marcus. "That's my name," she whispered. Marcus nodded grimly. "They mimic us," he said. "They know how to lure people out." The voices grew louder and more desperate as the knocking continued. It felt like they were trying every trick they could think of to get us to open that door. Then came something that made my blood run cold. A single guttural voice that didn't sound human at all. "Not now. Not here. But soon. We find you soon." The words were broken and unnatural, like whoever or whatever was speaking wasn't used to forming sentences. But it was clear enough for all of us to understand. Denise backed away from the window, her hands shaking. "What do they want?" she asked quietly. Marcus didn't answer right away. He just stared out into the darkness before turning back to us. "They want their forest back," he said simply. For a moment, everything went quiet again. No knocking, no voices. Just silence so heavy it felt suffocating. Then we heard a new sound, howling. A pack of wolves had entered the clearing outside the cabin, their silhouettes barely visible through the snowstorm. The wolves didn't seem interested in us. They were focused on something deeper in the forest. The knocking stopped abruptly, and I realized why. The creatures had retreated into the shadows, avoiding the wolves entirely. "They don't like competition," Marcus muttered under his breath. It gave us some breathing room for now, but we all knew it wouldn't last long. By morning, the wolves were gone, and the forest was eerily quiet again. It was a silence that didn't feel natural, like the trees themselves were waiting for something. None of us had slept much. The knocking, the voices, and the sheer weight of fear had kept us awake all night. "We can't stay here," I said, finally, breaking the silence. "The cabin isn't safe anymore. If we don't leave now, they'll come back." Denise looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Leave? In this storm? We'll never make it." Marcus nodded in agreement, but added, "Staying here is worse. They know we're here. They'll keep testing us until we're too weak to fight back." I didn't want to admit it, but Marcus was right. The cabin might have kept us safe for a while, but it wasn't going to hold forever. We needed to get to the main trail and back to the ranger station, if we could make it that far. "We'll go during daylight," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "They seem less active during the day." Marcus frowned but didn't argue. Instead, he started gathering supplies: flashlights, first aid kits, anything we could carry. Denise reluctantly joined him. "We need something to mask our scent," Marcus said as he rummaged through his pack. "They track us by smell." I stared at him, confused. "What do you suggest?" Marcus held up a small container of wolf urine he'd collected from the snow outside. "It's not perfect," he said, "but it might throw them off long enough for us to get away." Denise wrinkled her nose in disgust but didn't protest. At this point, none of us had room to argue about survival tactics. We spent the next hour preparing for the journey, packing food, water, and anything we could use as makeshift weapons. I kept my grandfather's old compass close to me. It had always been my lucky charm, and I needed all the luck I could get now. Before we left, Marcus warned us one last time. "Stick together. No matter what happens out there, don't get separated." We stepped out into the snow-covered clearing just as the sun began to rise. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening but still unnervingly quiet. The tracks from last night were gone, buried under fresh snow. The first few hours were uneventful. We followed the trail as best we could, using my compass and Marcus's knowledge of the terrain to guide us. But as we moved deeper into the forest, things started to change. Landmarks that should have been familiar looked different. Trees that had been straight now seemed twisted and warped. The trail itself seemed to shift under our feet, leading us in circles no matter how carefully we tried to follow it. "It's like the forest doesn't want us to leave," Denise muttered under her breath. Marcus didn't respond. He just kept moving forward with a determined look on his face. Then it happened. Denise stumbled over something in the snow and fell behind for just a moment. When she didn't catch up right away, I turned back to check on her. "Denise?" I called out. No answer. I ran back toward where she'd been but found nothing, just her footprints leading off into the trees before disappearing entirely. "Denise!" I shouted again, panic rising in my chest. Her scream echoed through the forest. Suddenly, a sharp, terrified sound that cut off as quickly as it started. Marcus grabbed my arm before I could run after her. "It's too late," he said firmly. "If you go after her now, you won't come back." I wanted to argue. I wanted to save her. But deep down, I knew he was right. We found her radio a few minutes later lying in the snow near a tree marked with claw-like scratches. It was covered in that same dark fluid I'd seen near the tracks before. We stood there in silence, staring at Denise's radio lying in the snow. The dark fluid smeared across it sent a chill through me. It was the same substance I'd seen by the tracks and on the elk carcass. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to pick up the radio. It was cold and sticky, and I had to fight the urge to drop it. "She's gone," Marcus said quietly. His voice was steady, but there was a sadness in his eyes. I wanted to argue, to tell him we couldn't just leave her behind, but I knew he was right. Whatever had taken her wasn't going to let her go, and if we stayed here any longer, we'd be next. We have to keep moving, Marcus said, his voice firm now. If we stop, they'll catch us. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. We left Denise's radio where it was and pressed on, deeper into the forest. The trees felt like they were closing in around us, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The snow muffled our footsteps, but every so often I thought I heard something behind us, a faint crunching sound, like someone, or something, was following. The forest didn't feel real anymore. Familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by strange stone formations, and trees marked with claw-like scratches. It was like the forest itself was alive, shifting and changing to keep us trapped. "Stay close," Marcus said, his voice low but urgent. "They're watching us." I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing, just endless trees and falling snow. But I could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. Then we saw it. An enormous tree loomed ahead of us, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Its trunk was massive, easily 3 times the size of any other tree in the forest. The bark was dark and gnarled, covered in strange carvings that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. Marcus stopped dead in his tracks, his face pale. "This is it," he whispered. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is their place," he said. "The elders called it the heart of the forest. It's sacred to them." As we stepped closer, I saw something that made my stomach turn. Bones scattered around the base of the tree. Some were animal bones, but others were unmistakably human. There were belongings, too. Tattered backpacks, torn clothing, rusted tools, all arranged in a way that felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. "They've been doing this for years," Marcus said grimly. "Decades, maybe." Before I could respond, a sound cut through the air, a low growl that made every hair on my body stand on end. It wasn't a wolf or a bear. It was something deeper, more guttural. "They're here," Marcus said sharply. "We need to move." But before we could take another step, they appeared. The creatures moved through the trees with impossible speed, their massive forms barely visible through the swirling snow. There were at least 5 of them now, maybe more. Their long limbs moved unnaturally fast as they circled us, staying just out of reach. One of them stepped forward into the clearing near the ancient tree. Its body was covered in thick black fur that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its face wasn't human or animal. It was something in between, with deep-set eyes that glowed faintly in the shadows. It didn't attack right away. It just stood there watching us with an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. Then it spoke. "Leave. Now." The words were broken and guttural, like it wasn't used to speaking our language. But they were clear enough. Marcus grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the trail. "We have to go," he said urgently. I didn't argue this time. We turned and ran as fast as we could through the snow-covered forest, the sound of heavy footsteps following close behind us. We ran blindly through the forest, the heavy footsteps of the creatures echoing behind us. The snow was deep, and every step felt like a struggle, but we didn't dare slow down. Marcus stayed ahead of me, his movements deliberate and focused, while I fought to keep up. My lungs burned with every breath, and my legs felt like they could give out at any moment. The forest seemed to shift around us as we moved. Trees that had been straight now twisted and warped, trails disappearing as quickly as they appeared. It was like the forest itself was alive, trying to trap us. "Keep going," Marcus shouted over his shoulder. "Don't stop." I didn't respond. I couldn't. All I could do was focus on putting one foot in front of the other. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound of footsteps stopped. The forest fell silent again, but it wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something is waiting just out of sight. Marcus slowed down and turned to look at me. "They're not chasing us anymore," he said quietly. I nodded, trying to catch my breath. "Why?" I asked, my voice shaky. Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he pointed ahead of us. "Because we're here." I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. It was the same enormous tree we'd seen before, the one Marcus had called the heart of the forest. Somehow, we'd circled back to it without realizing it. The carvings on the tree seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, almost like they were alive. The scattered bones and belongings around its base were still there, but now there were fresh markings in the snow, tracks leading directly to the tree's roots. Marcus stepped closer, his face pale but determined. "This is their sacred place," he said quietly. "It's where they bring their victims." I didn't want to believe him, but everything about this place felt wrong, like the air itself was heavier here. As we stood there staring at the tree, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a low growl coming from behind us. I turned, slowly, and saw them, the creatures, emerging from the shadows of the forest. There were more of them now, at least 7 or 8, their massive forms moving with unnatural speed and grace. They surrounded us in a loose circle, their glowing eyes fixed on us. One of them stepped forward again, the same one that had spoken before, and stopped just a few feet away from Marcus. Its face was partially hidden by its thick fur, but I could see its eyes clearly now, deep-set and intelligent, almost human. Marcus didn't flinch. He just stared back at it with a calmness I didn't understand. The creature tilted its head slightly before speaking again. "Leave. Or stay. Your choice." Its voice was guttural and broken, but the meaning was clear enough. Marcus turned to me and handed me his pack. "You go," he said firmly. "What?" I stammered, my heart racing. "What are you talking about?" "They won't let both of us leave," he said quietly. "But if I stay, if I give them what they want, you might have a chance." "No," I said immediately. "I'm not leaving you here." Marcus shook his head firmly. "You have to," he said. "If you don't make it back to the station, no one will ever know what happened here." I wanted to argue. I wanted to find another way, but deep down, I knew he was right. Before I could say anything else, Marcus stepped forward toward the creature near the tree. He didn't look back at me. He just kept walking until he disappeared into the shadows. The creatures didn't follow me as I turned and ran back toward what I hoped was the trailhead. All I could hear was my own breathing and the faint sound of Marcus's voice fading behind me. I don't remember much about how I made it out of the forest. It was all a blur, running through the snow, tripping over roots, and stumbling blindly, in the direction I hoped would lead me back to the ranger station. The forest felt endless, like it was stretching itself to keep me inside. Every time I thought I was making progress, I'd see something, a twisted tree, a strange marking, that made me feel like I was running in circles. But then, just as exhaustion was about to take over, I saw it, the faint outline of the main trail cutting through the trees. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I knew I wasn't safe yet. When I finally reached the ranger station, it felt like stepping into another world. The warmth of the building hit me like a wave, but my body was too numb to feel it fully. Bill Mackenzie, the senior ranger, was sitting at his desk when I burst through the door. "Alex," he said, standing up quickly. "What the hell happened to you?" I must have looked terrible. My clothes were torn, my face scratched from branches, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on to anything. "They're out there," I said, my voice hoarse. "The Watchers. They're real." Bill frowned and guided me to a chair. "Slow down," he said. "What are you talking about?" I tried to explain everything. The tracks, the elk carcass, Denise's disappearance, Marcus's sacrifice. But the words felt jumbled and incoherent. Bill listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed heavily. "Alex," he said slowly, "you've been out there too long. The cold, the isolation, it messes with your head." I'm not imagining this, I snapped, slamming my hand on the table. You think I did this to myself? You think Denise and Marcus just disappeared for no reason? Bill didn't answer right away. He just stared at me with that same unreadable expression before finally speaking. You're not the first ranger to come back with stories like this, he said quietly. Not by a long shot. His words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold outside. What do you mean? I asked. Bill hesitated before answering. Over the years, we've had reports. Strange sightings, unexplained disappearances, but nothing anyone could prove. The official line is always the same. Animal attacks or hikers getting lost in bad weather. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. But off the record, there's something in that forest we don't understand. I stared at him, my mind racing. Then why don't we close it off? Warn people. Bill shook his head slowly. And say what? That there are monsters in Blackwood Forest? No one would believe us. Not officially. He stood up and walked over to a filing cabinet, pulling out a folder filled with old reports and photographs. He handed it to me without saying a word. Inside were faded pictures of claw marks on trees, torn clothing found in snowdrifts, and blurry shapes caught on camera that looked disturbingly familiar. There were also handwritten notes, descriptions of encounters eerily similar to mine. I looked up at Bill, my hands shaking as I held the folder. You knew, I said quietly. He nodded grimly. We all know. Those of us who've been here long enough. Before I could respond, Bill took the folder back and locked it away again. The official report will say you were attacked by a bear, he said firmly. That's all anyone needs to know. I wanted to argue, to tell him we couldn't just ignore this, but I didn't have the strength. My body felt heavy, my mind numb from everything that had happened. As I left the station later that day, I glanced back at Bill one last time. He gave me a small nod but didn't say anything else. I don't know if anyone will ever believe what happened in Blackwood Forest that winter, or if they'll even care, but one thing is certain. Those creatures are still out there, watching from the shadows, and they always will be. My name is Jack Hawthorne, and I've been a park ranger for nearly 2 decades. Whispering Pine State Park has been my home for the last 5 years, a place where I thought I could escape the ghosts of my past. The towering ancient trees, the crisp northern Michigan air, and the quiet solitude helped me keep my demons at bay. Or so I thought. But everything changed one cold autumn evening. It started with a call from the sheriff's office. A family of campers, the Coopers, had vanished without a trace. They were supposed to check out that morning, but the park office never heard from them. Their car was still parked at the trailhead, and their campsite was eerily undisturbed. Lisa Chen, my new partner, was eager to help investigate. She was young and full of energy, but this wasn't going to be a routine search and rescue mission. I could feel it in my gut. Something about this felt wrong. We hiked to the Cooper family's campsite as the sun dipped below the horizon. The early snowfall had blanketed the ground, muffling every sound except for the crunch of our boots. When we arrived, everything looked normal at first glance. Too normal. Their tent was still pitched, their gear neatly arranged, and there were no signs of struggle. It was as if they had simply evaporated into thin air. But then we started noticing strange details. There were footprints circling the campsite, long, thin footprints that didn't match any animal I'd ever seen. They didn't lead anywhere. They just looped around in chaotic patterns before disappearing entirely. Lisa found something near the fire pit, a child's drawing on a scrap of paper. It showed tall, thin figures with hollow eyes standing among the trees, watching. My chest tightened as I stared at it. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched too. As night fell, the forest grew unnaturally silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping birds, just an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. Lisa tried to lighten the mood with nervous chatter, but her voice sounded small and fragile against the vast emptiness around us. I decided we needed to head back to the ranger station and regroup before continuing the search in daylight. But as we turned to leave, I heard it, a faint whisper carried on the cold breeze. It wasn't Lisa speaking. She had gone quiet, too. The whisper didn't sound like words. It was more like a feeling crawling up my spine. We hurried back to the station in silence, neither of us daring to speak about what we'd just experienced. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up early, my head still spinning from the strange events of the night before. Lisa was already at the ranger station, sipping coffee and staring out the window into the misty forest. She didn't say much, but I could tell she was shaken. I didn't blame her. I felt it too. Something about Whispering Pines had changed overnight, like the forest itself was holding its breath. We decided to start by talking to some locals in town. Maybe someone had seen or heard something unusual. Sheriff Tom Erickson joined us, though. He didn't seem convinced this was anything more than a case of lost campers. People get turned around in these woods all the time, he said with a shrug. You'll find them soon enough. But as we spoke to people in town, a different picture started to emerge. Several older residents mentioned strange disappearances. Over the years, campers, hikers, even hunters who had vanished without a trace. Most of them chalked it up to accidents or animal attacks, but one name kept coming up: Marcus Redfeather. He was an elder from a nearby Native American community and knew the forest better than anyone. Marcus agreed to meet us at his home near the park's edge. He was quiet at first, studying us with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through us. Finally, he spoke. "You're looking for answers," he said in a low voice, "but you won't like what you find." He told us about the legends of Whispering Pines, stories passed down for generations about beings called the Hollow Ones. According to Marcus, they weren't spirits or ghosts, but something far older and darker. They lived deep in the forest, feeding on those who wandered too close. "They don't kill," he said. "They hollow you out, take everything that makes you human and leave behind a shell." Lisa shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but I couldn't look away. His words felt too real, too close to what we'd seen at the campsite. Back at the park, things were getting stranger by the hour. Animals were behaving oddly, deer bolting through the trees as if something was chasing them, birds abandoning their nests en masse. Even my lucky compass, which had never failed me before, started spinning wildly when we ventured deeper into the woods. Lisa and I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. Ancient stone markers hidden among the trees. They were covered in strange symbols that looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. Jagged lines and spirals that seemed almost alive. When you stared at them too long, the air around those markers felt different, heavier somehow, and the silence was deafening. Lisa reached out to touch one of the stones, but I stopped her just in time. "Don't," I said firmly. "We don't know what we're dealing with." As we headed back toward the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every so often I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between trees or a flash of pale light, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. By nightfall, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever had taken, the Cooper family wasn't human. That night, Lisa and I decided to search the woods again. Something about the forest felt different after dark, like it was alive in a way it wasn't during the day. The snow had started falling harder, covering the ground in a thick, silent blanket. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. We followed the trail deeper into the restricted wilderness area, where few people ever ventured. The air felt colder here, sharper somehow, and the mist seemed thicker, clinging to us like a living thing. Lisa stayed close to me, her flashlight cutting through the fog in jittery beams. As we walked, I started noticing strange things. trees with bark that looked burned but smelled sweet, patches of ground where the snow wouldn't stick, and faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind playing tricks on us, but deep down, I knew better. Then I saw them. At first, I thought it was just shadows moving between the trees, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized they weren't shadows at all. They were figures, tall and impossibly thin, their pale bodies blending into the mist. They moved in ways that didn't make sense, almost like they were flickering in and out of reality. "Jack," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "Do you see them?" I nodded slowly, my hand tightening around my flashlight. The figures didn't seem to notice us. Or maybe they didn't care. They just drifted between the trees with an unnatural grace, their movements too smooth to be human. Suddenly, Lisa gasped and dropped her flashlight. "What's wrong?" I asked, turning to her. She looked dazed, her eyes unfocused as if she were staring at something far away. I don't know," she murmured. "I think I blacked out for a second." I felt a chill run down my spine. Lost time. It was something Marcus had warned us about. "Stay close," I said firmly. "We need to get out of here." But before we could leave, we stumbled upon something that stopped us cold. A cave entrance hidden behind a cluster of boulders. It wasn't marked on any map of the park, and judging by its overgrown appearance, no one had been here in years, or maybe even decades. From inside the cave came a sound that made my skin crawl. A faint whispering that wasn't quite human. It wasn't words exactly. It was more like feelings pressed into your mind. Fear, hunger, despair. Lisa took a step closer to the cave as if drawn by some invisible force. "Lisa!" I grabbed her arm and pulled her back. "We're not going in there." She blinked at me like she'd just woken up from a dream. "Sorry," she mumbled, shaking her head. "I don't know what came over me." We backed away from the cave slowly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside was watching us, waiting for us to come closer. By the time we made it back to the station, Lisa was pale and quiet. She didn't say much as she sat down at her desk and stared blankly at her hands. I knew then that whatever was out there in Whispering Pines wasn't just dangerous, it was something far worse. The next morning, Lisa wasn't herself. She sat at the ranger station, staring out the window with a blank expression. Her usual energy was gone, replaced by a quiet stillness that made me uneasy. I tried talking to her, but she barely responded, just nodded or muttered a few words under her breath. Her skin looked different too, paler than before, almost waxy. I told myself it was just the stress of everything we'd seen, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Marcus's words about the hollow ones kept echoing in my head. Was Lisa changing? I decided to check in with Dr. Evelyn Morris, the anthropologist who had been studying the park's folklore. She was skeptical of the supernatural, but she knew more about the history of Whispering Pines than anyone else. When I described Lisa's behavior and appearance, her face grew serious. "There are accounts," she said quietly, flipping through her notes. "Old stories about people who came into contact with these entities. They would start to change, slowly at first, but then faster as time went on. Their skin would grow pale, their movements unnatural, and eventually," she hesitated, looking at me. "Eventually, they weren't human anymore." I felt a lump in my throat as I listened. "Is there any way to stop it?" I asked. Dr. Morris shook her head. "Not that I've found. Once the transformation begins, it's usually too late." When I returned to the station, Lisa was gone. Panic set in as I grabbed my gear and headed into the woods to find her. The snow had stopped falling, but the mist was thicker than ever, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I called out her name over and over, but the only response was the eerie silence of the forest. Then I saw them, the Cooper children. They were standing in a clearing just ahead of me, their backs turned toward me. "Hey!" I shouted, running. toward them. But when they turned around, my heart nearly stopped. Their eyes were black, completely black, and their faces were blank, like masks without emotion. They didn't speak or move. They just stood there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. I froze in place, unsure of what to do. Then they turned and walked deeper into the forest without a sound, disappearing into the mist. I didn't follow them. I couldn't bring myself to move. But as I stood there trembling, I realized something horrifying. Whatever had taken them was using them as bait. When I finally found Lisa hours later, she was standing perfectly still in front of one of those ancient stone markers we'd seen before. Her eyes were wide and glassy, and her skin looked even paler than before. "Lisa," I said cautiously, stepping closer to her, "we need to get out of here." She didn't respond at first, just stared at the marker like she was hypnotized. Then she turned to me slowly, her movements unnaturally smooth. "They're coming," she whispered. "Who's coming?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't answer, just smiled faintly before collapsing to the ground like a puppet whose strings had been cut. I carried her back to the station as fast as I could, but I knew time was running out. Whatever had taken hold of Lisa wasn't letting go, and if we didn't act soon, she'd be lost forever. Lisa was barely conscious when I brought her back to the station. Her breathing was shallow, her skin cold to the touch, and her eyes seemed to flicker between normal and something darker. I didn't know what else to do, so I called Dr. Morris and Sheriff Erickson. Whatever was happening to Lisa, I couldn't handle it alone. Dr. Morris arrived carrying a stack of old books and papers, her face grim. "We need answers," she said firmly, "and I think we'll find them in that cave you mentioned." Sheriff Erickson wasn't thrilled about the idea. "You want us to go crawling into some hole in the ground based on campfire stories?" he scoffed. But when he saw Lisa lying on the couch, his expression changed. "Fine," he muttered, "but if this is some wild goose chase, I'm done." Marcus Redfeather joined us as we prepared to enter the cave. He didn't say much, just handed me a small pouch filled with herbs and told me to keep it close. "It won't stop them," he said quietly, "but it might slow them down." The cave entrance loomed before us like a mouth waiting to swallow us whole. The whispering sounds were louder now, echoing faintly from deep within. As we stepped inside, the air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in around us. The tunnels twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, like they were shifting as we moved through them. Sheriff Erickson marked our path with chalk, but every time we looked back, the markings were gone. Then we found the chamber. It was massive, with walls covered in ancient paintings that told a story too horrifying to comprehend. The figures in Tsitriutitis, the paintings were tall and thin, emerging from trees and dragging people into the forest. Some of the victims were shown changing, becoming like them. In the center of the chamber were cocoon-like structures hanging from the ceiling, each one pulsating faintly as if alive. Inside one of them, I saw a face, a human face twisted in agony. Sheriff Erickson swore under his breath and backed away. Dr. Morris examined the paintings closely, her hands shaking as she traced one of the symbols. "This isn't just folklore," she whispered. "It's history." Suddenly, a sound echoed through the chamber, a low growl that made my blood run cold. The partially transformed victims emerged from the shadows, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their hollow eyes locked onto us as they began to advance. Sheriff Erickson panicked and bolted down one of the tunnels despite my shouts for him to stay with us. His flashlight disappeared into the darkness, followed by a scream that was cut off abruptly. "We have to go," Dr. Morris shouted as she grabbed my arm. But before we could leave, Lisa appeared at the entrance to the chamber. Her skin was pale as snow now, her eyes dark and empty like those of the Cooper children. She moved with an eerie grace as she stepped closer to us, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Lisa," I said softly, trying to reach her. "It's me, Jack." She tilted her head like she was trying to remember me, but then she spoke in a voice that wasn't hers. You can't stop them. I knew then that Lisa was gone. I stood frozen, staring at Lisa, or what was left of her. Her voice echoed in the chamber, but it wasn't her voice anymore. It was layered, like multiple people speaking at once, and it sent a chill straight through me. Dr. Morris pulled me back, her voice urgent. "Jack, we can't stay here. She's not Lisa anymore." I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew she was right. Lisa's movements were too smooth, too unnatural. Her head tilted slightly as if she were studying us, and then she smiled. A cold, empty smile that made my stomach turn. Marcus stepped forward, holding the pouch of herbs he'd given me earlier. He muttered something under his breath in a language I didn't understand, and threw the herbs onto the ground between us and Lisa. For a moment, she hesitated, her expression flickering with something almost human. Fear? Pain? But then it was gone, and she stepped back into the shadows. Marcus turned to us, his face grim. "She's theirs now," he said quietly. "We have to leave." We hurried out of the chamber and back into the twisting tunnels. The whispers grew, louder as we moved, surrounding us like a living thing. The walls seemed to shift and close in around us, making it harder to find our way out. "Marcus," I said breathlessly as we ran, "what are these things? What do they want?" He didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning the tunnels for danger. Finally, he spoke. "They're not from here, not from this world. They're parasites. They feed on people, on their minds, their souls, and leave behind empty shells." Dr. Morris nodded as if everything suddenly made sense. "The forest," she said softly. "It's not just a place, it's part of them. That's why the animals are fleeing and why the compasses don't work here. The forest is alive. It's their hunting ground." I felt a wave of nausea as her words sank in. Whispering Pines wasn't just a park. It was a trap, a living organism designed to lure people in and feed them to these things. As we moved deeper into the tunnels, we found Sheriff Erickson, or what was left of him. He was slumped against the wall, his eyes wide open but completely black. His skin had started to change too, pale and waxy like Lisa's. "We're running out of time," Marcus said urgently. "If we don't stop this now, they'll spread beyond the forest." I didn't know how we were supposed to stop something like this, something so ancient and powerful. But I knew one thing for sure. We couldn't let them win. We barely made it out of the tunnels alive. The walls seemed to shift behind us, closing off paths and opening new ones, like the cave itself was trying to trap us. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were almost deafening. But somehow we found our way back to the surface. The forest was waiting for us. The moment we stepped outside, the air changed. It was heavier now, thick with a strange, sweet scent that made my stomach churn. The trees seemed taller, their branches twisting unnaturally toward us like skeletal hands. The mist was thicker than ever, swirling around our feet as if it had a mind of its own. Marcus stopped abruptly, his eyes scanning the forest. "They know we're here," he said quietly. Before I could ask what he meant, the ground beneath us began to tremble. The trees groaned and creaked as their roots tore free from the earth. One by one, they began to move, slowly at first, then faster, their massive trunks bending and twisting in ways that defied nature. "They're waking up," Dr. Morris whispered, her voice trembling. The trees weren't just trees anymore. They were part of whatever was controlling this forest. Their branches lashed out like whips, tearing through the mist as they reached for us. We ran as fast as we could, dodging roots that erupted from the ground and branches that swung down like clubs. But it wasn't just the forest coming after us. From the shadows emerged figures, dozens of them. They were the partially transformed victims we'd seen in the cave. their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, their pale skin glistening in the dim light, and leading them was Lisa. She stepped forward slowly, her movements smooth and deliberate. Her black eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of recognition, like a part of her was still in there, fighting to get out. But then she smiled that cold, empty smile again, and I knew she was gone. Dr. Morris grabbed my arm. "We can't fight them," she said urgently. "We have to get to the cave entrance and seal it before it's too late." Marcus nodded grimly. "The cave is their gateway. If we collapse it, we might be able to cut them off." The problem was getting there. The forest came alive around us as we ran, trees uprooting themselves to block our path, roots snaking across the ground to trip us up. The transformed victims followed close behind, their hollow eyes glowing brighter as they closed in on us. One of them lunged at Dr. Morris, its claw-like fingers swiping at her arm. She cried out in pain but kept running, clutching her bleeding arm as we pushed forward. Finally, we reached the cave entrance. Marcus pulled out a bundle of explosives he'd brought with him, old dynamite sticks wrapped tightly together, and began setting them around the entrance. But the creatures weren't going to let us finish without a fight. Lisa stepped forward again, her black eyes fixed on me. "Jack," she said softly, her voice layered with that strange echoing tone. "You don't have to do this." I froze for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. It sounded like her, like the real Lisa. But I knew better. This wasn't her anymore. It was them speaking through her. "Don't listen to it," Marcus shouted as he worked frantically to set up the explosives, but Lisa, or whatever she had become, took another step closer. "You can join us," she said. "It's not so bad, once you let go." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to look away and focus on Marcus's work. "How much longer?" I asked him urgently. "Almost there," he muttered through gritted teeth. Dr. Morris stepped forward suddenly, holding a flare in her hand. "Go!" she shouted at me and Marcus. "I'll hold them off." "No!" I shouted back, but before I could stop her she lit the flare and threw herself toward the advancing creatures. The last thing I saw was her surrounded by those hollow-eyed figures as she swung the flare wildly in every direction. Her screams echoed through the forest as Marcus finished setting up the explosives and grabbed my arm. "We have to go," he shouted. We ran as fast as we could away from the cave entrance, leaving Dr. Morris behind. When we were at a safe distance, Marcus handed me the detonator. "Do it," he said quietly. I hesitated for just a moment, long enough for Lisa's face to flash through my mind again. But then I pressed the button. The explosion shook the ground beneath our feet as fire and debris erupted from the cave entrance. The creatures screamed, a high-pitched wail that made my ears ring, and then everything went silent. The forest stopped moving. The mist began to clear, and for a moment I thought it was over. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The explosion left the forest eerily quiet. The mist began to lift, revealing the twisted remains of the cave entrance. Marcus and I stood there, catching our breath as the echoes of the blast faded into the distance. For a moment, I thought we'd done it, that we'd stopped whatever was lurking in Whispering Pines. But then I saw them. The transformed victims didn't vanish like I'd hoped. They were still there, standing motionless among the trees. Their hollow eyes stared at us, unblinking, and their pale skin glistened faintly in the moonlight. It was as if they were waiting for something, or someone. "We didn't stop them," Marcus said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. "We only slowed them down." I couldn't believe it. After everything we'd been through, after losing Lisa and Dr. Morris, it still wasn't over. The forest was alive, and whatever was controlling it wasn't going to let us go so easily. Marcus grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the ranger station. "We need to warn people," he said urgently. "If this spreads beyond the park." I didn't need him to finish the sentence. If these things escaped Whispering Pines, there'd be no stopping them. As we ran through the forest, I started noticing subtle changes. The trees weren't moving anymore, but their branches seemed darker, almost charred. The ground was littered with strange seedlings, tiny plants that looked alien, their roots pulsing faintly like veins. And then Sheriff Erickson appeared. He stepped out from behind a tree, his black eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. His movements were smooth and deliberate, just like Lisa's had been before she transformed completely. "Jack," he said in that layered voice that wasn't his own, "you can't run from this." Marcus pulled out a knife and stepped between me and Erickson. "Keep moving," he said firmly. "I'll handle him." "No," I shouted, but Marcus didn't listen. He lunged at Erickson with the knife, aiming for his chest. Erickson moved faster than I thought possible, dodging Marcus's attack and grabbing him by the throat. Marcus struggled against him, but Erickson's strength was unnatural, inhuman. I couldn't just leave him there. Grabbing a fallen branch from the ground, I swung it as hard as I could at Erickson's head. The impact knocked him backward, giving Marcus just enough time to break free. "Go!" Marcus shouted again, his voice strained. We ran together toward the ranger station, leaving Erickson behind in the shadows. But I knew he wouldn't stay down for long. When we finally reached the station, I grabbed the radio and called for help. "This is Ranger Jack Hawthorne," I said urgently. "We need immediate evacuation of Whispering Pines State Park." The human dispatcher on the other end sounded confused, but promised to send help right away. Marcus leaned against the wall, breathing heavily as he looked out the window into the forest. "They're not done," he said quietly. "They'll find another way." I didn't respond. I couldn't. All I could do was hope that we'd bought enough time to stop them before it was too late. The ranger station felt like a fragile bubble of safety, but I knew it wouldn't last. Marcus sat by the window, clutching his knife, his eyes scanning the forest for movement. I was pacing, my heart racing as I tried to think of what to do next. The radio crackled occasionally, but there was no sign of help arriving anytime soon. And then the storm came. It started with a low rumble, like distant thunder, but it wasn't natural. The air grew heavy, charged with something that felt alive. The wind picked up, howling through the trees and shaking the windows of the station. The mist returned, thicker than before, swirling around the building like it was trying to get inside. "They're coming," Marcus said quietly. Before I could respond, the lights flickered and went out. The station was plunged into darkness, and all I could hear was the sound of the storm and the faint whispers that seemed to come from every direction. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, but the beam barely cut through the mist. Marcus lit a lantern, its warm glow casting eerie shadows across the room. And then I saw them. Figures appeared in the mist outside, tall and thin, their movements smooth and deliberate. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly as they surrounded the station, their pale bodies blending into the swirling fog. Among them was Lisa, her black eyes fixed on me as she stepped closer to the window. "They're not going to stop," Marcus said, firmly. "We have to end this." "How?" I asked desperately. "We already collapsed the cave." Marcus hesitated for a moment before pulling out an old leather pouch from his jacket. "There's one more thing we can try," he said. "It's an ancient ritual, something my ancestors used to weaken them. I didn't understand how a ritual could stop something this powerful, but at this point, I had no choice but to trust him." Marcus began preparing the ritual, drawing symbols on the floor with ash from the fireplace and chanting softly under his breath. The air inside the station grew colder as he worked, and I could feel the presence of those things pressing against us like a weight. The storm outside grew louder, shaking the walls of the station as if trying to tear it apart. The figures moved closer, their hollow eyes glowing brighter as they surrounded us completely. And then Lisa spoke. "Jack," she said in that layered voice that wasn't hers, "you don't have to fight this." Her voice sent a chill down my spine. She sounded calm, almost kind, but I knew it was a lie. Whatever was speaking through her wasn't Lisa anymore. "They'll take you," Marcus said urgently as he continued chanting. "They'll use your memories, your pain, to break you." He was right. Lisa's voice shifted suddenly, mimicking someone else entirely. My old war buddy from Vietnam who had died, saving my life. "Jack," it said softly, "you don't have to carry this anymore." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to focus on Marcus's chanting instead of the voices trying to break me. Suddenly, Marcus shouted something in his native language and threw a handful of herbs into the fire pit. The flames roared to life, casting bright light across the room and pushing back against the mist outside. The figures recoiled slightly, their movements jerky and unnatural as they tried to resist whatever Marcus had done. "It's working," Marcus shouted over the noise of the storm. But then Lisa stepped forward again, closer than before, and pressed her hand against the window pane. The glass cracked under her touch as she stared at me with those empty black eyes. "Jack," she whispered softly. "Let go." I didn't know what came over me in that moment, whether it was anger or desperation, but I grabbed my lucky compass from my pocket and held it tightly in my hand. "This saved me once," I muttered under my breath. "It'll save me again." With one final push of courage, I turned toward Marcus and nodded. "Do it," I shouted. Marcus threw another handful of herbs into the fire pit and shouted something louder than before, a word that seemed to vibrate through the air itself. The storm outside exploded into chaos as lightning struck nearby trees and wind tore through, branches like knives. The figures screamed, a high-pitched wail that made my ears ring, and then they began to dissolve into mist. Lisa was the last to disappear. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine one final time before she faded away completely, leaving behind only silence. The silence after the storm was deafening. The mist had cleared, and the forest stood still, as if holding its breath. Marcus and I stayed frozen for a moment, staring at the empty space where the figures had been. The warmth of the fire crackled softly behind us, but it felt distant, like it belonged to another world. "Did we stop them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcus didn't answer right away. He stared out the window, his face lined with exhaustion. Finally, he let out a long breath and said, "For now." Those two words hit me harder than I expected. For now. It wasn't over, not really. We'd closed the cave, performed the ritual, and driven them back, but I could feel it in my gut. They weren't gone. Not completely. We stepped outside into the cold night air. The forest looked different. The trees were still standing, but they seemed quieter somehow, like they were watching us. The ground was littered with strange seedlings, tiny plants that pulsed faintly with an otherworldly glow. Marcus knelt down and picked up one of the seedlings, turning it over in his hand. "They'll try again," he said softly, "one way or another." I didn't know what to say to that. All I could think about was Lisa, how she'd fought so hard to stay human but had been taken anyway, and Dr. Morris, who'd sacrificed herself so we could make it out alive. We walked back to the ranger station in silence. The radio crackled faintly as I sat down at my desk and stared at the map of Whispering Pines spread out in front of me. The cave was marked with a red X now, a place no one would ever go again. At least, that's what I told myself. The official report labeled everything as a tragic wildfire and landslide caused by unstable ground near the cave system. No mention of the hollow ones or what we'd seen in those tunnels. No mention of Lisa or Sheriff Erickson or the Coopers. I was hailed as a hero for evacuating the park and preventing further loss of life, but it didn't feel like a victory. Not with everything I'd seen and lost. A few days later, as I was packing up my things to leave Whispering Pines for good, I noticed something on the windowsill of the station, a small seedling growing in a tiny patch of soil. It looked ordinary, At first glance, just another plant, but as I leaned closer, I saw it pulse faintly with that same otherworldly glow as the ones we'd seen in the forest. My heart raced as I reached out to touch it, but before my fingers could make contact, its tiny tendrils shot out like lightning and wrapped around my wrist. I froze, staring at it in horror as it tightened its grip. The whispers returned, soft at first but growing louder with every passing second. And then, nothing. The tendrils loosened and fell away like dead vines, leaving behind only a faint mark on my skin, a mark that looked eerily similar to the symbols we'd seen in the cave. I stared at it for a long time before grabbing my bag and walking out of the station without looking back. As I drove away from Whispering Pines for what I hoped would be the last time, one thought kept running through my mind. They weren't gone. Not really, and someday, they'd be back. My name is Sarah Reynolds. I'm a wildlife biologist, and for the past few weeks I've been stationed in Pinewood Valley National Park in the Colorado Rockies. It's a remote wilderness area, thick with forests and steep mountain terrain. Winter here is brutal. Heavy snowfall, biting winds, and temperatures that can freeze you solid. But I'm used to tough conditions. I've spent years studying predator behavior in harsh environments, and before that, I served in the military. Survival training is second nature to me. I came here to investigate strange patterns in animal behavior. Predators, like wolves and mountain lions, seem to be avoiding certain areas of the forest entirely, and prey animals were disappearing at an alarming rate. At first, I thought it might be due to human activity, illegal hunting, or maybe even some kind of environmental disturbance. But what I found was far stranger than anything I could have imagined. It started with the tracks. Massive footprints in the snow, bigger than anything I'd ever seen before. They were humanoid, 2 legs instead of 4, but far too large to be human. Each step was spaced wide apart as if whatever made them was towering over me. I followed them for hours, but they disappeared near a rocky outcrop where the snow had melted slightly. That night, I checked my trail cameras. Most of the footage was normal. Deer grazing, a fox darting through the trees. But then I saw it. A blurred figure moving through the darkness. It was tall, much taller than any person or animal I'd seen before, and it moved with an unnatural speed. The image was distorted, almost like the camera itself had malfunctioned. At first, I thought it might be a bear standing on its hind legs or maybe even a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. My equipment started acting up shortly after that. Batteries draining faster than usual, cameras shutting off randomly. It felt like something didn't want me to see what was out there. The next morning, I ventured deeper into the forest to set up new cameras and investigate further. That's when I found them. The mutilated remains of a deer. Its body was torn apart in a way that didn't make sense. The wounds weren't consistent with any predator I knew of. They were too precise, almost ritualistic. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, and every now and then I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Later that day, I met Joseph Redbird Collins, one of the park rangers assigned to this area. He's from one of the local indigenous tribes and knows these mountains better than anyone else. When I told him about the tracks and the mutilated deer, he didn't seem surprised. "You've seen them," he said quietly. "Seen what?" I asked. "The hunters," he replied. "They come out during the darkest nights of winter." I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking or trying to scare me, but his expression didn't change. He told me about tribal legends, stories passed down for generations about creatures that stalk these mountains during the hunger moon, when food is scarce and desperation sets in. I didn't believe him at first. Legends are just stories, right? But as the days went on and more strange things happened, more tracks appearing near my cabin, more animals disappearing, I started to wonder if there might be some truth to what he said. And then came the night when everything changed. The next few days felt heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like I was being watched, though I could never see anything. Even the animals seemed to sense it. There were fewer tracks, fewer signs of life. It was like the whole valley was retreating into silence. I decided to talk to Redbird again. If anyone could help me make sense of this, it was him. We met at his ranger station, a small wooden building tucked away in the trees. He greeted me with a nod but didn't say much at first. When I showed him the photos of the tracks and the blurred figure from my camera, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "These mountains have secrets," he said, his voice low and steady. "Things people don't talk about because they don't want to believe they're real." I asked him what he meant, and he told me more about the legends of the hunters. According to his tribe's stories, they weren't animals or humans, but something in between, shapeshifters that could take on different forms. They were said to be intelligent, cunning, and dangerous, especially during the winter months when food was scarce. "They don't just hunt for survival," Redbird said. "They hunt for sport." I wanted to dismiss it as folklore, but something about the way he spoke made me hesitate. He wasn't trying to scare me. He genuinely believed what he was saying. And after everything I'd seen, the tracks, the mutilated deer, the strange behavior of my equipment, I wasn't sure I could argue with him. Later that day, Dr. Kurt Wilson arrived at my cabin. He was sent by the government to evaluate my research and make sure everything was scientifically sound. Kurt was older than me, in his 50s, with a sharp mind and a skeptical attitude. He didn't believe in myths or legends. Everything had to have a logical explanation. When I showed him my findings, he barely glanced at them before dismissing them as hoaxes or misidentifications. "Probably just a bear," he said when I mentioned the tracks. "Or someone playing tricks on you." I tried to explain that no bear could leave tracks like that or mutilate an animal in such a precise way, but he wasn't interested. He insisted on coming with me into the forest to prove there was nothing unusual going on. The weather took a turn for the worse that evening. A heavy snowstorm rolled in, cutting off most of our communication with the outside world. My cabin felt smaller than ever as the wind howled outside and snow piled up against the windows. Kurt sat by the fire flipping through my notes with an air of boredom. "You're chasing shadows," he said at one point. "There's nothing out there but wildlife." I didn't respond. Instead, I stared out the window into the darkness beyond. Somewhere out there were answers. Answers I wasn't sure I wanted to find. The storm didn't let up. By the next night, we were completely cut off. No phone signal, no way to radio for help. The snow was so thick it swallowed the world outside, leaving us trapped in a bubble of silence. Kurt, still convinced I was chasing ghosts, decided he wanted to go out and see for himself. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I couldn't let him wander off alone. We geared up and headed into the forest, our flashlights cutting narrow beams through the swirling snow. The cold bit into my skin, even through layers of clothing, but I ignored it. My focus was on the tracks, those massive footprints I'd seen before. If they were still there, maybe Kurt would finally believe me. It didn't take long to find them. They were fresh, leading away from the cabin and deeper into the woods. Kurt stopped when he saw them, his flashlight hovering over one of the prints. "Big bear," he muttered, though his voice lacked confidence. I didn't reply. Instead, I pointed out how the tracks were spaced, far too wide for any bear, and how they seemed to move in a straight line, like something walking upright. Kurt frowned but didn't argue. We followed the trail for what felt like hours, though it was probably less than one. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. The wind seemed to die down, and even the crunch of our boots on the snow felt muffled. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then we saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a tall figure moving between the trees ahead of us. My heart stopped as I froze in place, gripping my flashlight tightly. Kurt whispered something I couldn't hear, his voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. The figure stepped closer, just enough for me to make out its shape. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. It stood on two legs but was covered in dark fur, its arms long and clawed. Its head was wolf-like with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. It stared at us for a moment before disappearing into the trees with an unnatural speed. Kurt swore under his breath and stumbled backward. "What? What was that?" he stammered. I didn't have an answer. My mind raced as I tried to process what I'd just seen. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. It wasn't anything I'd ever encountered before. We turned back toward the cabin, moving as quickly as we could without breaking into a full sprint. Every few steps I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing eyes again. But the forest remained empty, or at least it looked that way. When we finally reached the cabin and locked ourselves inside, Kurt collapsed onto a chair by the fire. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly. "It's just an animal," he muttered to himself, though he didn't sound convinced. I checked my recording equipment later that night and found something chilling. Audio clips of low growls and strange vocalizations that sounded almost human. The creature had been close, closer than I'd realized, and it had been watching us. For the first time since arriving here, I felt genuinely afraid. The next morning, the storm showed no signs of letting up. The snow was piled high against the cabin, and the wind rattled the windows like it was trying to get inside. Kurt barely spoke. He just sat by the fire staring into the flames. I could tell he was shaken by what we'd seen, even if he refused to admit it. I was reviewing my equipment, trying to make sense of the audio recordings, when I heard a knock at the door. It startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not in weather like this. Kurt looked up, his face tense. I opened the door to find a family standing on the porch, shivering and covered in snow. There were 4 of them, a man and woman in their 40s, their teenage son, and a small dog that was barking nervously. The man introduced himself as Mr. Daniels and explained that their car had broken down on the road nearby. They'd been trying to make it to a lodge but got lost in the storm. "Can we stay here until it clears up?" he asked, his voice tight, with worry. I couldn't say no. The cabin wasn't big, but it was warm and safe, or at least safer than being out in the storm. I helped them inside and gave them blankets while Kurt muttered something about bad timing. The dog, a small terrier named Max, immediately started pacing around the cabin. He sniffed at the corners and growled at the windows, his ears pinned back. I tried to calm him down, but he refused to settle. It was like he could sense something we couldn't. That night, things got worse. The Daniels' teenage son, his name was Jake, claimed he saw someone outside. He'd been looking out the window when he spotted a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. At first, he thought it was a person, but then he noticed how tall it was and how its eyes seemed to glow in the dark. "It was watching us," Jake said quietly, his voice trembling. I grabbed my flashlight and went to check, but there was nothing there, just snow and shadows. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jake wasn't lying. As the night went on, Max's behavior grew more erratic. He barked at random intervals and refused to go near certain parts of the cabin. When I tried to take him outside for a quick walk, he pulled against his leash so hard I had to carry him back inside. The forest felt alive with tension. Every sound, the creak of the cabin walls, the howl of the wind, seemed sharper than before. And then came the voices. At first, I thought I was imagining it, a faint sound drifting through the storm. But as I listened closer, I realized it wasn't just noise. It sounded like someone calling out for help. Only their voice was wrong. It was too deep and distorted, like it had been stretched or twisted somehow. Kurt heard it too. He sat up straight in his chair and looked at me with wide eyes. "Is that?" he started to say but didn't finish. I didn't answer. Instead, I checked my cameras again and found something chilling. Blurred figures moving just outside the cabin's perimeter. They were circling us like predators stalking prey. The Daniels family huddled together in one corner of the room while Max barked furiously at the door. Jake kept glancing out the window as if expecting to see those glowing eyes again. "They're studying us," I whispered to Kurt. He didn't respond. He just stared at me with an expression that said everything I needed to know. We weren't alone anymore. The storm seemed endless, trapping us in the cabin like prisoners. The Daniels family tried to stay calm, but I could see the fear in their eyes. Even Kurt, who had been so dismissive before, was quieter now. He kept glancing at the windows, his jaw clenched tight. That night, things took a turn for the worse. Started with Max. The little dog had been restless all day, pacing and barking at nothing. But as darkness fell, he grew frantic. He scratched at the door, whining and growling like he was desperate to get outside, or maybe desperate to get away from something inside. I tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't listen. Then, suddenly, he stopped barking. He stood still by the door, his ears pinned back and his body trembling. Before I could stop him, he bolted outside into the snow. "Max!" Jake shouted, running after him. I grabbed my flashlight and followed Jake out into the storm. The cold hit me like a wall, but I pushed through it, calling out for Max. The snow was deep and blinding, making it hard to see more than a few feet. Ahead, Jake stopped abruptly and pointed toward the tree line. "There," he said. I aimed my flashlight in the direction he was pointing and froze. There was blood, bright red against the white snow, and tracks leading away from it. They weren't Max's tracks. They were bigger, heavier, humanoid. Jake whispered, his voice breaking. I pulled him back toward the cabin, my heart racing. Whatever had taken Max was still out there, and I wasn't about to let it take anyone else. When we got back inside, I locked the door and checked all the windows. The Daniels family looked at me with wide eyes, their fear now palpable. Mr. Daniels tried to comfort Jake while his wife sat silently in the corner, her face pale. "They're getting closer," Kurt said quietly from his chair by the fire. I nodded, but didn't respond. My cameras confirmed what I already knew. The creatures were circling us now, testing our defenses. They moved with an eerie intelligence, avoiding the cameras and staying just out of sight. But every so often, I caught glimpses of them. Tall figures with glowing eyes and clawed hands. The voices came back that night, louder than before. They sounded human at first, pleas for help or cries of pain. But there was something wrong about them. The tones were off, distorted in a way that made my skin crawl. "They're trying to lure us out," Redbird had warned me earlier when we talked about the legends. Now I understood what he meant. Kurt decided he'd had enough of sitting around and insisted on going outside to investigate. "This is ridiculous," he said as he pulled on his coat. "We're letting fear control us." I tried to stop him. To explain that whatever was out there wasn't something we could handle, but he wouldn't listen. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the storm alone. He didn't come back for hours. When he finally stumbled through the door, his face was pale and his coat was torn. Blood soaked one of his sleeves where something had clawed him deep. Enough to leave marks. It's not human," he muttered as he collapsed into a chair. I cleaned his wound as best I could while he described what happened. He'd seen one of the creatures up close. A towering figure with fur-covered limbs and glowing eyes that seemed to burn into him. It had attacked him without hesitation, but retreated when he shined his flashlight directly into its face. "They don't like light," Kurt said weakly. That gave me an idea, a desperate one. But it might be our only chance of survival. Kurt's injury made everything feel more real, more urgent. Whatever was out there wasn't just watching us anymore. It was testing us, pushing closer, and now it had drawn blood. I couldn't stop replaying his words in my head. "They don't like light." It wasn't much to go on, but it was something. That night, Redbird arrived at the cabin. I hadn't expected him. No one should have been traveling in the storm. But there he was, standing on the porch with snow clinging to his coat. He stepped inside without a word, his face grim. "I brought something," he said, pulling a worn leather book from his bag. It looked old, the pages yellowed and brittle. "These are records from my tribe, stories about the hunters." The room fell silent as he opened the book and began flipping through the pages. The Daniels family huddled together in the corner, while Kurt leaned forward, his injured arm resting on the table. Even Jake stopped fidgeting long enough to listen. Redbird pointed to a drawing, a crude sketch of a tall, wolf-like figure standing on two legs. Around it were symbols I didn't recognize but felt oddly familiar. "These creatures come during the hunger moon," he explained, "when winter is at its worst and food is scarce. They hunt not just for survival, but for power, for dominance over the land." He went on to describe how they weren't fully animal or human, but something in between. Shapeshifters that could move between forms. According to the legends, they were vulnerable to light, especially certain frequencies that disrupted their ability to maintain their shape. "They fear fire," Redbird said, "and they fear light that burns brighter than their own." I thought about my research equipment, the experimental cameras and light-based deterrents I'd brought with me to study predator behavior. If these creatures were truly vulnerable to light, maybe I could use my equipment against them. But there was more. Redbird showed us another page in the book, a list of dates spanning decades. Each date marked a year when attacks had occurred, in Pinewood Valley. The pattern was clear. Every 30 years, during the darkest nights of winter, the hunters returned. "This year marks another cycle," Redbird said quietly. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized what he meant. We weren't just dealing with random encounters. This was part of something bigger, something that had been happening for generations. As we talked, I noticed Jake staring at one of the symbols in the book, the same symbol I'd seen carved into trees near the tracks and even etched into some of the mutilated animals. "What does that mean?" Jake asked, pointing to it. Redbird hesitated before answering. "It's their mark," he said. "A warning and a claim." I didn't know what scared me more. The idea that these creatures were marking their territory or the possibility that we were already inside it. The storm grew worse that night, howling around the cabin like it was alive. The wind slammed against the walls and the snow piled so high against the windows that we couldn't see anything outside. It felt like the world had shrunk down to just this one room, and the weight of what Redbird had told us hung heavy in the air. We tried to keep busy, checking the doors, reinforcing the windows, but there was only so much we could do. The Daniels family stayed close together, whispering quietly while Jake kept glancing at the book Redbird had brought. Kurt was pale and weak from his injury, but he refused to rest. He sat near the fire, gripping a flashlight like it was his lifeline. I was setting up my equipment, modifying my cameras and light traps to emit stronger beams, when I heard it. A low growl, deep and guttural, coming from just outside the cabin. Everyone froze. "What was that?" Mrs. Daniels whispered, her voice trembling. I grabbed my flashlight and moved toward the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by a sound that made my blood run cold, scratching. Something was clawing at the walls. "They're here," Redbird said quietly. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and then came another sound. Voices. At first, they were faint, distorted by the wind, but as I listened closer, I realized they were mimicking us. I heard Jake's voice calling for Max, even though he was sitting right next to me. Then I heard Kurt's voice saying something he hadn't said all night. "They're trying to lure us out," Redbird warned. I checked my cameras and saw them. Tall figures moving through the snow, circling the cabin like wolves stalking prey. Their glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, and their movements were deliberate, calculated. They weren't rushing in. They were testing us. Then came the first breach. The power went out suddenly, plunging us into darkness except for the faint glow of the fire. Mr. Daniels jumped up to check the generator but stopped when Redbird grabbed his arm. "Don't go out there," he said firmly. But Mr. Daniels didn't listen. He grabbed a flashlight and opened the door before anyone could stop him. The cold rushed in like a wave as he stepped outside into the storm. "Dad!" Jake shouted. We waited in tense silence as Mr. Daniels disappeared into the snow. A few minutes later, we heard him scream, a short, sharp cry that cut off abruptly. Jake bolted for the door, but I grabbed him before he could leave. "You can't go out there," I said firmly. "But my dad," he started to say before breaking down, into sobs. I locked the door again and tried to calm him down while Mrs. Daniels stared blankly at the floor, tears streaming down her face. Kurt stood by one of the windows with his flashlight aimed outside, his face pale and grim. "They're getting in," he muttered. He was right. The creatures weren't just circling anymore. They were attacking. We heard more scratching at the walls and saw claws tearing at the edges of one of the windows. Redbird grabbed a piece of wood from near the fire and began chanting softly under his breath, a ritual meant to ward off evil spirits. I focused on my equipment, praying that my modified light traps would work. If these creatures truly feared light, it might be our only chance of survival. The next breach came faster than I expected, a loud crash as one of the windows shattered completely. Snow poured into the room along with a clawed hand that reached inside, grabbing blindly for anything it could find. Kurt swung his flashlight toward it, and for a moment it recoiled as if burned by the beam of light. "They don't like it," Kurt shouted. I turned on one of my modified cameras, flooding part of the room with an intense beam of light. The creature outside screamed, a horrible sound that echoed through the forest and disappeared into the snow. But there were more of them. The cabin was falling apart. The shattered window let the icy wind whip through the room, and the sound of claws scraping against wood was relentless. We were surrounded, and it was clear the creatures weren't going to stop until they got inside. Every second felt like an eternity. I knew we couldn't hold out much longer. The barricades wouldn't last, and the creatures were getting bolder with every attack. If we didn't come up with a plan, we wouldn't survive the night. "They fear the light," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos around us. "It's our only chance." Kurt nodded weakly from his chair, clutching his flashlight like it was a weapon. Redbird continued his quiet chanting, his voice calm but firm. The Daniels family looked at me with desperation in their eyes, waiting for me to tell them what to do. I explained my idea quickly. I would modify my remaining equipment to emit stronger beams of light powerful enough to disrupt the creature's form. Redbird would perform a ritual to protect us while we set traps around the cabin to slow them down. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was all we had. "We need to work together," I said firmly. "If we stick to the plan, we can make it through this." Everyone nodded, even Jake, who wiped his tears and stood up with determination in his eyes. We moved fast. I worked on my equipment while Kurt and Jake set up noise traps near the doors and windows, pots and pans tied together to create a racket if anything tried to break in. Redbird spread ash from the fireplace around the cabin's perimeter, muttering prayers under his breath as he worked. Mrs. Daniels helped me connect wires and batteries, her hands trembling but steady enough to get the job done. The creatures didn't wait for us to finish. As I adjusted one of my cameras, I heard another loud crash. A second window shattered, followed by snarling that sent chills down my spine. Jake screamed as a clawed hand reached inside, grabbing for him. Kurt swung his flashlight toward it again, and the creature recoiled with another horrible scream. "They're getting smarter," Redbird said grimly. I turned on one of my modified light traps just as another creature tried to break through the door. The beam of light hit it directly, and for a moment, its form flickered. Its fur melted away, revealing something almost human beneath before it disappeared into the snow. "It's working," I shouted. but there were too many of them. The noise. Traps slowed them down, and Redbird's ritual seemed to keep them at bay for a while, but they kept coming, clawing at the walls, breaking through every weak point they could find. My equipment was running low on power, and I knew we couldn't keep this up much longer. "We have to leave," Kurt said suddenly. "We can't stay here." "How?" Mrs. Daniels asked desperately. "The storm. There's an emergency vehicle at the ranger station," Redbird said. "If we can make it there." His voice trailed off as another crash shook the cabin. The door splintered slightly under the weight of something massive. It wasn't safe here anymore. We had no choice but to try. We didn't have much time to think. The creatures were breaking through the cabin's defenses, and the walls wouldn't hold for much longer. Redbird's mention of the emergency vehicle at the ranger station gave us a sliver of hope, but getting there meant heading straight into the storm and into the creatures' territory. "We'll use the light traps to keep them back," I said, trying to sound confident. "Stick together no matter what happens. If we make it to the ranger station, we'll have a chance." Everyone nodded, though fear was etched into their faces. Jake clung to his mother's arm, his eyes wide. Kurt struggled to stand but managed to grab one of the flashlights and a makeshift weapon, a piece of wood with nails hammered into it. Redbird packed his ritual supplies, his movements calm and deliberate. I grabbed my modified cameras and light equipment, praying they would hold out long enough for us to escape. The moment we opened the door, the cold hit us like a wall. The snow was blinding, and the wind howled so loudly it drowned out everything else. But it didn't take long for us to realize we weren't alone. The glowing eyes appeared first, dozens of them, scattered through the trees like fireflies in the dark. The creatures moved closer, their forms barely visible through the storm. They were massive, hunched figures with clawed hands and wolf-like faces that flickered unnaturally in the light of our flashlights. "Stay close," I shouted over the wind. We moved as quickly as we could, stumbling through the deep snow toward the ranger station. The creatures followed us, their growls cutting through the storm like knives. Every few steps, one of them would lunge forward, testing our defenses. I turned on one of my light traps just as a creature charged at Kurt. The beam hit it directly and its form flickered violently. Its fur melted away for a moment, revealing something pale and human-like beneath before it. Retreated with a scream. "They don't like it!" Kurt shouted again, swinging his flashlight wildly. Redbird chanted softly as he walked beside me, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. He threw handfuls of ash into the snow, creating small barriers that seemed to slow the creatures down. But they kept coming, circling us like predators waiting for their moment. We were halfway to the ranger station when one of them broke through our defenses completely. It lunged at Mr. Daniels from the side, its claws catching him before he could react. He screamed as it dragged him into the snow, disappearing into the darkness before anyone could stop it. "Dad!" Jake shouted, trying to run after him. I grabbed Jake and pulled him back toward the group. "We can't go after him," I said firmly. "We have to keep moving." Mrs. Daniels sobbed quietly as she stumbled forward, her face pale and frozen with shock. Jake cried silently beside her but kept walking. The creatures grew bolder as we neared the station. They moved faster now, darting between trees and lunging at us from every direction. My equipment was running low on power. The light traps flickered weakly with each attack, and I knew we couldn't keep this up much longer. Then came the worst moment of all. One of the creatures lunged at Kurt from behind, knocking him to the ground before he could react. He swung his flashlight at it desperately but couldn't get away fast enough. "Go!" he shouted as he fought back with everything he had. "Don't stop, just go." I hesitated for half a second before Redbird grabbed my arm and pulled me forward. "We can't save him," he said firmly. Kurt's screams echoed behind us as we ran toward the ranger station. We didn't stop running. The ranger station was just ahead, its outline barely visible through the swirling snow. My lungs burned from the cold and my legs felt like they could give out at any moment, but I forced myself to keep moving. Redbird stayed close to me, his chanting now a whisper, while Mrs. Daniels and Jake stumbled behind us, their faces pale and frozen with fear. The creatures were relentless. I could hear them snarling and growling behind us, their glowing eyes, cutting through the darkness like fire. Every few seconds, one of them would lunge forward, testing our defenses again. My light traps were flickering weakly now, their power almost completely drained. "Just a little further," I shouted, though my voice was barely audible over the wind. We reached the ranger station moments later, crashing through the door and slamming it shut behind us. Redbird shoved a heavy shelf against the door while I turned on every flashlight and piece of equipment I had left, flooding the room with light. The creatures didn't follow us inside immediately. They circled the building instead, their growls echoing through the storm. I could see their shadows moving past the windows, clawed hands scraping against the glass. "They're waiting," Redbird said quietly. Mrs. Daniels collapsed onto a chair, holding Jake tightly as he cried into her shoulder. I checked my equipment again, but most of it was dead. Only one light trap was still working, and even that wouldn't last much longer. "We can't stay here," I said. "They'll get in eventually." Redbird nodded but didn't say anything. He looked tired, more tired than I'd ever seen him, but his expression was calm. Then we heard it. Engines roaring in the distance. I ran to the window and saw them. Military vehicles cutting through the snow, headlights piercing through the darkness like beacons of hope. Soldiers poured out of the trucks moments later, armed with weapons I didn't recognize. They moved quickly and efficiently, surrounding the station and opening fire on the creatures without hesitation. The creatures screamed as they were hit. Horrible. Sounds that made my skin crawl, but they didn't retreat immediately. They fought back with terrifying speed and strength, lunging at the soldiers and tearing through their ranks like wolves attacking prey. It was chaos outside. Gunfire mixed, with snarls and screams, but after what felt like hours, it was over. The creatures retreated into the forest one by one until only silence remained. One of the soldiers entered the station moments later, his face hidden behind a mask. He looked at me briefly before speaking in a low voice. "You shouldn't be here," he said firmly. I tried to ask him what was going on, what those creatures were, but he ignored my questions. Instead, he confiscated my equipment and told us we'd be escorted out of the park immediately. The official report later listed everything as animal attacks caused by severe winter conditions. My research was dismissed as inconclusive, due to equipment malfunction. But I knew better. As we left Pinewood Valley that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Redbird had said. The stories about the hunters returning every 30 years during the darkest nights of winter. Similar events had been documented before, but buried under layers of cover-ups and denials. When I got home weeks later, I noticed something strange. A small mark on my arm near my wrist. A symbol that matched one of those in Redbird's book. It wasn't there before. I don't know what it means or why it appeared. But deep down, I know this isn't over.